The Force connects all living things across the galaxy, binding them in an invisible web of energy and destiny. But what happens when something from beyond the stars arrives, not through the Force, but through the cold machinery of corporate ambition and scientific hubris? What happens when a man who has built an empire on lies meets his mirror image in a galaxy built on legends? Stan Edgar had faced many impossible situations in his tenure as CEO of Vought International. Superhero scandals, governmental investigations, corporate espionage, all managed with calculated precision and ruthless efficiency. But waking up on a cold Durasteel floor in a facility he didn't recognize, surrounded by white-armored soldiers pointing unfamiliar weapons at him, was a new experience entirely. The air tasted metallic. Recycled. The architecture was brutalist, industrial, reminding him of Vaught's less public facilities, but with an aesthetic decades removed from anything he knew. The soldiers' armor gleamed under harsh lighting, their weapons humming with an energy signature that made his skin prickle with instinctive warning. "On your feet," one soldier commanded, voice filtered through a helmet that obscured all humanity. Stan complied, moving slowly, deliberately. Show no fear. Assess. Adapt. The principles that had kept him alive in boardrooms filled with superhumans would serve him here, wherever here was. His last memory was fragmented. Vaught's research division testing a new application of Compound V, something about dimensional energy readings, and then a sensation like being torn apart and reassembled atom by atom. They marched him through corridors that spoke of military precision. Personnel moved with purpose, their uniforms bearing insignias he didn't recognize. Through viewports, he glimpsed something that stopped his breathing: stars. Not Earth's familiar constellations, but an alien sky dense with unfamiliar formations. And ships, vessels that defied every principle of aerospace engineering he understood, their designs more art than science, moving with impossible grace through the void. Not Earth, he murmured, the first words he'd spoken since arriving. Silence, the soldier snapped. They brought him to a command center, all tactical displays and holographic projections showing planetary systems and fleet movements. And there, standing before a massive viewport overlooking what appeared to be a construction facility in orbit, stood a man in an Imperial officer's uniform. A man with Stan Edgar's face. The officer turned, and Stan felt something he rarely experienced: genuine shock. The resemblance was perfect. Not similar. Not close. Identical. Same bone structure, same calculating eyes, same carefully controlled expression that revealed nothing while observing everything. Fascinating, the officer said, voice nearly identical to Stan's own, though with a subtle accent that suggested different linguistic roots. When my scientists reported the dimensional breach and what came through, I thought it was some new Republic trick. A clone, perhaps. Or an elaborate holographic deception. He stepped closer, studying Stan with the intensity of a man examining his own reflection. But you're real. Flesh and blood. And you're me. Not quite, Stan replied, recovering his composure. I'm Stan Edgar, CEO of Vought International. And you are? Moff Gideon. Commander of this Imperial Remnant fleet and overseer of certain, classified projects. Gideon gestured, and the soldiers lowered their weapons. Tell me, Mr. Edgar, in your universe, do you believe in destiny? In the force that binds all things? I believe in leverage, Stan said. In understanding systems and exploiting them for maximum advantage. In your universe, what do you believe in? Gideon smiled, a small, cold expression that Stan recognized because he'd worn it himself 1,000 times. I believe in power. In its acquisition and application. The empire I served has fallen, but empires can be rebuilt by men who understand that sentiment and tradition are weaknesses to be exploited, not strengths to be celebrated. Stan glanced at the tactical displays, noting fleet positions, resource allocations, planetary designations. His mind, trained to absorb and analyze massive datasets in seconds, began constructing a picture of this universe's power structures. You said dimensional breach. That suggests you have the technology to detect and possibly manipulate such phenomena. Our understanding is developing, Gideon admitted. The energy signature that preceded your arrival was unprecedented. My scientists are still analyzing the data. But that's not what interests me most about your presence here, Mr. Edgar. He gestured to a holographic display that materialized between them, showing what appeared to be a corporate organizational chart, though the terminology was alien. Before we discuss your situation, I want to know what you built in your universe. What empire did a man with my face command? Stan understood the real question: are you useful, or are you a liability to be eliminated? It was the same calculation he'd made countless times about others. Now the equation had reversed, and he was the variable being assessed. I built the most powerful corporation in my world, Stan said, choosing his words with precision. Vought International controlled superhuman individuals, beings with extraordinary abilities far beyond normal humans. We marketed them as heroes, controlled their public image, managed their deployments, and extracted profit from every aspect of their existence. Governments paid us for security. Citizens paid us for safety. And the superhumans themselves? They paid us with their loyalty, because we controlled the one thing they needed most: relevance. Gideon's expression shifted. Not much, but enough for Stan to recognize interest. Controlled superhumans. In this galaxy, we have force wielders. Jedi, Sith, and those touched by that mystical energy. The Emperor believed he could control them through fear and power. He was partially correct. But control requires more than force. It requires systems. Systems are my specialty, Stan said. Though I'm curious, if you're interested in my expertise, that suggests you see value in keeping me alive. What exactly do you need that your own strategic mind hasn't already provided? Because I know what I don't know, Gideon replied. I'm a military commander. I understand warfare, tactics, fleet operations. I can inspire loyalty through fear and calculated displays of power. But the galaxy is changing. The new republic is weak but vast. The imperial remnants are scattered. Traditional military conquest will fail, the empire proved that. What's needed is a different approach. Something more subtle. More insidious. He paused. Corporate, perhaps. Stan saw it then. The opportunity that existed in every crisis. A galaxy in transition, power structures collapsing and reforming, and two identical strategists who could exploit that chaos in ways neither could alone. Gideon had resources, military assets, and understanding of this universe's political landscape. Stan had corporate methodology, experience managing individuals with godlike power, and a complete absence of sentiment that would make him effective in ways even Gideon might not anticipate. You're proposing an alliance, Stan said. It wasn't a question. I'm proposing we discover what two men with the same face and similar philosophies can accomplish when they stop competing and start collaborating. Gideon extended his hand, a gesture that seemed almost ceremonial in this context. The question is whether you're willing to build a new empire in a galaxy that isn't your own. Stan looked at the offered hand, at the face that mirrored his own, at the tactical displays showing a galaxy ripe for exploitation. In his universe, he'd built Vought from inherited assets into a global power. Here, he had nothing, no resources, no leverage, no power base. Except he had one thing, a doppelgänger with imperial military assets and the same ruthless pragmatism that had made Stan Edgar the most dangerous man in his own world. He shook Gideon's hand. Let's build something they'll never see coming. Outside the viewport, stars burned cold and distant. Neither man could know that their handshake would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. That their corporate military hybrid would threaten both New Republic and Imperial Remnant alike. That the Mandalorian who had already cost Gideon so much would become their most dangerous opponent. Or that in the end, two identical faces could never truly share one empire. But in that moment, as their alliance formed, the Force itself seemed to ripple with warning. A disturbance that sensitive individuals across the galaxy would feel but not understand. Something new had entered the equation. Something without Force sensitivity or ancient heritage. Just human ambition, perfected and doubled. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The hatch sealed behind Stan Edgar as Gideon led him deeper into the facility. Neither man looked back. Forward was the only direction that mattered now. Forward, into a galaxy that had no idea what was coming. Tell me everything about this new republic, Stan said as they walked. Every weakness, every structural flaw, every senator who might be persuaded by the right incentive. Gideon smiled. This is going to be a productive partnership. The facility Gideon commanded was a marvel of Imperial engineering retrofitted with purposes far darker than its original military design. Stan followed his doppelganger through corridors where scientists in gray uniforms worked on projects that ranged from familiar, weapons development, surveillance systems, to utterly alien. Tanks filled with suspended creatures, genetic sequencers analyzing samples that glowed with an inner light, and most disturbing, a chamber where children slept in containment fields while machines measured something the readouts called M-count. The Emperor's final obsession, Gideon explained, noting Stan's interest. Force sensitivity. The ability to manipulate that energy field that binds this galaxy together. He believed it could be measured, quantified, and eventually replicated or transferred. He gestured to the sleeping children. These specimens have the highest concentrations we've recorded. My research was aimed at understanding if that power could be extracted. Stan studied the data streams with the same clinical detachment he'd once applied to Compound V test subjects. And can it? Not yet. The Force resists technological manipulation in ways that defy conventional scientific method. It's almost as if it has will. Gideon's tone carried frustration. Which is why your arrival interests me beyond mere physical coincidence. You said you controlled superhumans. How? They entered what appeared to be Gideon's private command chamber, spartanly furnished with tactical efficiency. A desk, holographic displays, and a single object that immediately drew Stan's attention, a black-bladed weapon mounted on the wall, its hilt gleaming with Beskar silver. Leverage points, Stan said, settling into a chair without invitation, a calculated gesture of equality. Every superhuman had something they wanted. Fame, acceptance, purpose, or simply the belief they were doing good. Vought provided those things in exchange for control. We owned their image rights, managed their public perception, and most importantly, we controlled the substance that gave them power. Compound V. Without us, they were nothing. With us, they were gods. That dependency is the foundation of control. Gideon poured 2 glasses of something amber from a crystal decanter, Corellian whiskey, Stan would later learn. In this galaxy, the Force cannot be controlled by any corporation. It simply exists, and those born sensitive to it can access that power regardless of external approval. The Jedi tried to manage Force sensitives through their order, indoctrination from childhood, strict codes, emotional suppression. The Sith controlled through fear and the promise of unlimited power. Both approaches had limitations. Because they addressed the symptom, not the system, Stan said, accepting the glass. The Jedi made Force users dependent on philosophical approval. The Sith made them dependent on hierarchical power structures. Neither created genuine systemic dependency. They could always walk away. Precisely. Gideon raised his glass in acknowledgement. Which brings us to our current situation. The New Republic is barely holding together. Multiple sectors maintain independence or semi-autonomy. The former imperial military is scattered across 1,000 remnant factions, each led by ambitious Moffs and admirals who think they can restore the empire through conventional military force. They're all fools. Military conquest advertises opposition, Stan observed. It creates martyrs and unifies resistance. Vought never conquered. We integrated. We made ourselves essential to the existing power structures until removing us would collapse the system itself. Gideon nodded slowly, and Stan recognized the expression. It was the same look he'd worn when a subordinate finally grasped a concept he'd been waiting for them to understand. The new republic consists of thousands of member worlds, each with their own governments, defense forces, and economic systems. They're bound together by idealism and the memory of defeating the empire. But idealism fades. Memory weakens. What remains is self-interest. Stan pulled up the holographic display between them, manipulating the interface with surprising ease. The controls were intuitive enough that his experience with Vaught's systems translated adequately. He studied the new republic's political structure, and what he saw made him almost smile. This is barely a government. It's a coalition held together by committee. Who holds enforcement power? Distributed across member worlds. The new republic maintains a defense fleet, but nothing approaching the empire's scale. Their philosophy is that centralized military power enables tyranny, so they deliberately weaken their own enforcement capability. Then they've already lost, Stan said flatly. They just don't know it yet. A government without enforcement power is just a social club with pretensions. The question isn't whether the new republic will fall, it's who will be positioned to fill the vacuum when it does. Imperial remnants are the obvious answer, Gideon said. But as I mentioned, conventional military restoration will fail. The galaxy won't accept another empire imposed by star destroyers and stormtroopers. They need to choose it. Or more accurately, they need to believe they're choosing something else while we build the infrastructure of control. Stan understood immediately. Corporate integration. You don't invade worlds, you offer them services they need. Security contracts. Infrastructure development. Economic partnerships. Within 5 years, they're dependent on your systems. Within 10, removing your presence would cause collapse. Within 20, no one remembers there was ever an alternative. Except I lack the expertise to build such a system, Gideon admitted. I'm a military commander. I can secure territory and eliminate opposition. But creating the kind of insidious dependency you describe requires experience I don't possess. And I lack resources, knowledge of this galaxy's political landscape, and any legitimate claim to authority here, Stan countered. Which makes this partnership more valuable than either of us alone. You provide military assets, political connections, and understanding of galactic culture. I provide corporate methodology, experience managing superhuman assets, and strategies for systemic integration that won't trigger resistance. Gideon set down his glass with deliberate precision. There's another factor we haven't discussed. Our identical appearance. I was wondering when you'd address that. In this galaxy, cloning technology exists. The Republic used clone troopers during the Clone Wars, millions of identical soldiers grown from a single template. When people see us together, they'll assume cloning. That assumption can be useful. Gideon pulled up an image, a planet with gleaming cities and vast oceans. Kamino. The cloning facilities that created the Grand Army of the Republic. Officially destroyed by the Empire. Actually, merely, commandeered for other purposes. Stan leaned forward, interest sharpening. You have access to cloning technology? Limited access. The Kaminoans were thorough in their security protocols, and much of their advanced techniques were lost when the Empire purged their world. But yes, we have cloning capabilities. Accelerated growth, memory imprinting, genetic modification within certain parameters. He paused. It occurs to me that a corporation built on managing individuals with extraordinary abilities might benefit from controlled production of such individuals. The implications crystallized in Stan's mind with the speed that had made him Vaught's most effective CEO. You're suggesting we create a private superhuman force. Not force-sensitive, you said, that can't be replicated. But enhanced through genetic modification and training. Combined with the technology we've recovered, Gideon agreed. Dark troopers, advanced combat droids with capabilities exceeding standard military units. Clone soldiers with genetic enhancements and memory imprinting for immediate expertise. A private military corporation that offers superior security services to worlds struggling under New Republic's inadequate defense umbrella. And once they're dependent on that security, Stan continued, we expand into infrastructure, resource management, governance consultation. Within a decade, we're not occupying these worlds, we're running them through contracts they signed voluntarily. Precisely. We call it corporate governance through mutual benefit. They get stability and protection. We get integration and control. And unlike the Empire's military occupation, there are no star destroyers in orbit to inspire rebellion. Just helpful corporate partners ensuring their world's prosperity. Stan stood, moving to the viewport where he could see the facility's operations continuing below. Scientists working on projects they likely didn't fully understand. Soldiers following orders without questioning their purpose. Resources being allocated with cold efficiency toward goals only the commanders truly grasped. It was familiar. It was Vaught's methodology translated into a galactic scale. We'll need a name, Stan said. Something that suggests security and prosperity. Something that sounds beneficial, not threatening. The Empire made the mistake of advertising its authoritarianism, Gideon agreed, joining him at the viewport. Our organization should sound protective. Helpful. Essential. They stood in silence, two identical men looking out at the same stars, thinking in parallel paths toward the same conclusion. Stan spoke first, the name forming with the inevitability of a carefully calculated strategy. Aegis Corporation. It suggests protection, defensive strength, mythological reliability. We're not conquerors, we're protectors. We're not occupiers, we're partners. And by the time anyone realizes what we've actually built, dismantling it would cause more damage than accepting it. Gideon smiled, that cold expression of satisfaction that Stan wore so well himself. Aegis Corporation. I like it. Subtle. Professional. Completely unthreatening until you realize the Aegis doesn't just protect. It controls everything behind it. When do we begin? Immediately. But there's one complication we need to address first. Gideon pulled up a holographic image of a figure in Beskar armor. This is Djarin. A Mandalorian bounty hunter who has already cost me considerably. He destroyed my facility on Navarro, stole an asset I was developing, and claimed the Darksaber, that weapon on my wall, through combat. He represents a variable I've been unable to eliminate or control. Stan studied the armored figure, noting the body language, the weapon configurations, the fact that the armor itself appeared both ancient and highly advanced. Mandalorians. I saw references in your tactical files. Warrior culture, bound by honor codes, apparently significant political influence despite small numbers. They're a symbol, Gideon said with barely concealed frustration. Defeated by the Empire, scattered across the galaxy, yet somehow still relevant because they represent an ideal of resistance and independence. If we're building a corporate structure, the Mandalorians represent exactly the kind of cultural obstacle that can inspire others to resist. Then we don't fight them, Stan said, the strategy forming as he spoke. We do what Vought did with troublesome superhumans. We make them irrelevant. We build around them. And if they continue to interfere. He paused, considering. We make them famous. We turn them into exactly what you said, symbols. Symbols are powerful, but they're also constraining. The more legendary something becomes, the more it must live up to that legend. And legends have predictable patterns. Gideon looked at Stan with something approaching respect. You're suggesting we weaponize their own culture against them. I'm suggesting we do what I've always done, understand what people value, and use that value as leverage. This Mandalorian values honor, protection of his asset, and his warrior code. Those aren't weaknesses to attack directly. They're pressure points to manipulate indirectly. Stan turned from the viewport. But first, we need to establish Aegis Corporation's legitimacy. We need a target world, somewhere struggling under inadequate New Republic protection, somewhere that would welcome corporate security assistance. I have several candidates, Gideon said, pulling up a star chart. Outer Rim worlds, minimal New Republic presence, regular pirate or Imperial remnant harassment. They're desperate for stability and have resources that would fund our expansion. Stan studied the options with the calculating precision that had built an empire in his own universe. Here, in this galaxy of Force users and ancient warrior cultures and political chaos, he would build another. Not alone this time. With his mirror image. With someone who understood that sentiment was weakness and power was the only currency that mattered. This one, Stan indicated a planet called Quell. Mining world, strategic hyperspace routes, current government requesting New Republic military assistance they're not receiving. Perfect candidate for corporate intervention. Gideon nodded. I'll prepare the diplomatic outreach. We'll need corporate documentation, financial projections, security proposals. All the legitimate infrastructure of a real corporation. I'll handle that, Stan said. It's what I'm best at. Making the exploitation look like salvation. They stood together, two identical faces reflected in the viewport's transparisteel, and for a moment, it was impossible to tell where Stan Edgar ended and Moff Gideon began. Two men from different universes with the same ruthless clarity of purpose. Two strategists who understood that the most effective conquest looked nothing like an invasion. Aegis Corporation was born in that moment. And the galaxy had no idea what was coming. The New Republic Senate chamber on Hosnian Prime buzzed with the controlled chaos of a government that had never quite figured out how to govern. Stan Edgar observed from the public gallery, studying the political theater below with the same analytical detachment he'd once applied to congressional hearings in his own universe. Beside him, wearing civilian clothes rather than his imperial uniform, Moff Gideon maintained the posture of a successful businessman attending routine political proceedings. They looked like brothers. Twins, perhaps. The official story Aegis Corporation circulated was simpler. Gideon was the public face, the former imperial officer who'd seen the light and now dedicated his expertise to protecting struggling worlds through private enterprise. Stan was his corporate strategist and financial architect, a role vague enough to justify his presence without inviting excessive scrutiny. 3 weeks had passed since their alliance formed. 3 weeks of careful preparation, document fabrication, and strategic positioning. Aegis Corporation now existed as a legal entity within New Republic jurisdiction, registered on Corellia with manufactured corporate history suggesting 10 years of smaller-scale security operations in the corporate sector. The falsified records were perfect, Gideon's intelligence network had ensured that. The financial backing appeared legitimate, Stan's understanding of corporate shell structures had ensured that. Now came the real test, political legitimacy. Senator Sandra Voss of Quell stood at the podium, her frustration evident despite professional composure. She was young for a senator, mid-30s, Stan estimated, with the earnest idealism that reminded him of every board member who'd ever tried to introduce ethics clauses into VOT contracts. Those clauses never lasted. Neither would her idealism. For the 4th consecutive session, I request military assistance for the Quell system, Voss said, her voice carrying through the chamber's acoustics. Pirate raids have increased 70% in the last quarter. Our mining operations are under constant threat. Workers are fleeing to safer systems. Our economy is collapsing, and the New Republic continues to promise aid that never materializes. From the Senate leadership platform, Chancellor Mon Mothma responded with practiced sympathy that meant nothing. Senator Voss, the defense fleet is stretched across thousands of systems. We're prioritizing based on threat assessment and strategic importance. Quell's situation is noted, but we're not important enough, Voss interrupted, abandoning protocol. We're an outer rim mining world. We don't have the political capital of core worlds. So we're left to defend ourselves with outdated defense platforms and local security forces armed with equipment from the Clone Wars era. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, sympathy mixed with apathy. Stan recognized the dynamic instantly. It was the same calculation that had allowed Vought to integrate into municipal governments across America. When official resources were inadequate, private alternatives became acceptable. When governments failed to protect their citizens, those citizens welcomed anyone who could. The senator raises valid concerns, Mon Mothma acknowledged. However, increasing military presence in the Outer Rim raises its own complications. Many worlds joined the rebellion specifically to escape heavy military presence. We must balance security needs against our foundational principles of local autonomy. Translation, Stan thought, we have neither the resources nor the political will to help you. You're on your own. Senator Voss returned to her seat, defeated but not quite broken. Stan watched her carefully, noting body language, the way her aide whispered urgent consolation, the resignation settling across features too young to have fully accepted political reality's cruelty. That's our opening, Stan murmured to Gideon. She'll be receptive, Gideon agreed. But we need to approach carefully. Too eager suggests desperation. Too casual suggests we don't take her world's suffering seriously. I'll handle the approach. You prepare the security assessment and proposal documentation. We meet with her tomorrow, after she's had time to feel the full weight of the Senate's abandonment, but before she explores alternative solutions. They left the gallery separately, maintaining the fiction of casual business associates rather than coordinated strategists. Stan made his way through Hosnian Prime's governmental district, observing the architecture of democracy that the New Republic had constructed. Grand buildings, symbolic statues, memorials to fallen heroes. It was impressive in the way all political theater was impressive. Designed to inspire confidence in systems that functioned far less effectively than their aesthetic suggested. His communicator chimed, Gideon's secure frequency. Our Quell intelligence package just arrived. Forwarding to your datapad now. Stan pulled up the information as he walked, scanning through economic data, security incident reports, geological surveys, and most importantly, political profiles. Senator Voss was exactly what her public persona suggested. Genuine, idealistic, elected on promises to improve her world's economic situation and protect its workers. No scandals, no corruption, no obvious leverage points. Which made her perfect. People without corruption were the easiest to manipulate, they actually believed in principles, which meant those principles could be exploited. By the time Stan reached the discreet hotel where Aegis Corporation maintained its Hosnian Prime presence, he'd constructed the entire approach. Gideon was waiting in their secured suite, surrounded by holographic displays showing security assessments, corporate proposals, and financial projections. She's clean, Stan observed, settling into a chair. No financial irregularities, no questionable associations, genuinely committed to her world's well-being. That makes her dangerous, Gideon said. True believers are unpredictable. True believers are entirely predictable, Stan corrected. They believe in something, which means they'll sacrifice anything to protect that belief. Senator Voss believes in protecting Quell. We offer her the means to do exactly that, and she'll welcome us because we're giving her what she genuinely wants. And in exchange, we gain our first legitimate client world. One that requested our services, signed contracts voluntarily, and provides a template for expansion across similar struggling systems. Stan studied the security assessment Gideon had prepared, It was thorough, professional, and deliberately designed to demonstrate Aegis Corporation's superior capability. Pirate threat analysis, defensive infrastructure recommendations, rapid response protocols, and most cleverly, a cultural sensitivity framework that promised to respect local autonomy while providing effective protection. This is excellent, Stan said. It addresses their immediate need while positioning us as respectful partners rather than occupiers. The cultural sensitivity angle is particularly smart. It directly contrasts us with the Empire's approach. The Empire's greatest mistake was believing fear alone ensured compliance, Gideon said. Fear is effective short-term, but it requires constant reinforcement and inevitably inspires rebellion. Gratitude and dependency are far more sustainable control mechanisms. Vought's fundamental operating principle, Stan agreed. Make them need you. Make them thank you for being needed. And make certain that removing you causes more damage than accepting your presence. They worked through the night, refining proposals and anticipating objections. By morning, Aegis Corporation's offer to Quell was a masterpiece of corporate seduction, solving immediate problems while embedding long-term dependency, respecting local government while gradually assuming essential functions, and pricing services just low enough to seem generous while ensuring sustainable profit margins. Senator Voss agreed to meet them at a cafe near the Senate building, neutral ground, public enough to avoid impropriety but private enough for sensitive discussion. Stan arrived first, ordering CAF and studying the other patrons. Politicians, lobbyists, journalists. The same ecosystem that existed in every capital, where power was traded in conversations that would never appear in official records. Gideon arrived precisely on time, dressed in expensive but understated civilian attire. They sat together, two identical faces drawing curious glances from nearby tables. Let them wonder. Let the story spread that there were two of them. It would be useful later. Senator Voss arrived 3 minutes late, calculated to demonstrate she wasn't desperate, Stan noted with approval. She maintained professional composure as she joined them, though her eyes widened slightly at their identical appearance. Senator Voss, thank you for meeting with us, Gideon began, his tone perfectly calibrated between respectful and confident. I'm former Moff Gideon, founder of Aegis Corporation. This is my partner, Stan Edgar, our strategic operations director. The resemblance is remarkable, Voss said, recovering quickly. Are you related? Distant family, Stan lied smoothly. One of those genetic coincidences that makes family reunions confusing. But we're not here to discuss genealogy. We're here because we believe we can help Quell. Voss's professionalism wavered slightly. You were at the Senate session yesterday. We were, Gideon confirmed. We attend regularly, monitoring situations where our services might be valuable. Your world situation particularly concerned us. Because you see profit opportunity, Voss said, not quite accusatory but testing their honesty. Stan appreciated directness, it made manipulation simpler. Yes. We're a corporation, Senator. We operate for profit. But profit and genuine assistance aren't mutually exclusive. Quell needs security services the New Republic can't or won't provide. We can provide those services effectively, sustainably, and at a cost your world's economy can support. Everyone benefits. Except your former Imperial, Voss said, looking at Gideon. Your record shows you served the Empire until its collapse. Why should Quell trust someone who represented everything the rebellion fought against? Gideon didn't flinch, he'd anticipated this exact question. Because I learned from the Empire's mistakes, Senator. I saw firsthand how military occupation and authoritarian governance inspire resistance rather than stability. The Empire believed power alone ensured control. It was wrong. What I'm building with Aegis Corporation is fundamentally different, partnership rather than domination, consent rather than coercion. I can't undo my past service, but I can ensure my expertise benefits worlds that need protection rather than oppressing them. It was a perfect answer, acknowledging culpability without apologizing, promising reform without seeming desperate for redemption. Stan saw Voss's resistance softening. She wanted to believe there could be a solution. She needed to believe it. What exactly are you proposing? Voss asked. Stan slid a datapad across the table. A comprehensive security partnership. Aegis Corporation deploys a defensive fleet to quell 3 light cruisers, 12 patrol craft, and supporting infrastructure. We establish a regional operations center that coordinates threat response across your system. We train and equip local security forces to modern standards. And we do all of this under contract to your planetary government, subject to your legal oversight and renewable annually based on performance metrics you define. Voss scrolled through the proposal, her expression shifting from skepticism to cautious interest. This is extensive. The cost is structured as a percentage of mining revenue protection, Gideon interjected. We only profit if we successfully defend your operations. If pirate raids continue at current levels, you pay nothing beyond baseline operational costs. We succeed together, or we don't succeed at all. It was a lie, of course. The contract's fine print contained clauses that would ensure Aegis Corporation's profitability regardless of security outcomes. But those clauses were buried in legal complexity that would take weeks to fully analyze, and Senator Voss needed a solution now, not after comprehensive legal review. Who else are you working with? Voss asked. What's your track record? Quell would be our first major client, Stan admitted, deploying honesty as a tactical weapon. We're a new organization, Senator. But our leadership has extensive experience. Moff Gideon's military background speaks for itself, and my own corporate management experience spans decades across multiple sectors. We're offering you a ground floor opportunity. First client means you receive our complete attention and resources. Later clients will compete for those resources. Voss looked between them, these 2 identical men offering salvation wrapped in corporate efficiency. Stan could see the calculation behind her eyes, the same calculation he'd seen in countless negotiations. She knew this might be a mistake. She knew she should conduct more thorough due diligence. She knew accepting corporate military services set precedents that might haunt the new republic's idealistic governance philosophy. But her world was suffering. Her people were leaving. Her economy was collapsing. And the Senate had made it abundantly clear that no help was coming. I need to present this to Quell's governing council, Voss said finally. They make the final decision. Of course, Gideon said. We respect local governance. That's fundamental to our operating philosophy. I'll be honest with you both, Voss continued, her idealism showing through professional caution. I want to believe this could work. But I've seen what happens when worlds rely too heavily on external forces for security. The Empire started as a promise of protection too. The Empire imposed itself, Stan said quietly. We're offering partnership. You maintain sovereignty, legal authority, and the ability to terminate our contract if we fail to meet your standards. We're not conquerors, Senator. We're service providers. The moment we stop providing valuable service, you stop paying us. It's that simple. It wasn't that simple. It never was. But the lie was beautiful in its elegant simplicity, and Senator Voss wanted desperately to believe it. I'll present your proposal to the council within the week, she said, standing. Thank you for your time. They watched her leave, this idealistic young senator carrying their poison pill back to her world, wrapped in promises and professional presentation. She'll recommend approval, Gideon said after Voss was out of earshot. She has no choice, Stan agreed. We gave her the solution she needed, priced it affordably, and structured it to seem voluntary. Within 6 months, Quell will be the most secure system in their sector. Within a year, 3 neighboring systems will request similar services. Within 5 years, Aegis Corporation will be integrated into a dozen worlds' essential infrastructure. And the new republic will welcome it, Gideon added. Because we're solving problems they can't solve, freeing their resources for other concerns, and doing it through legitimate corporate contracts that don't threaten their political philosophy. Stan smiled. That cold expression of satisfaction he rarely allowed himself in public. In his universe, he'd built Vought into an institution so essential that removing it would collapse entire social systems. Here, with Gideon's resources and this galaxy's political chaos, he would build something even more insidious. Not an empire imposed by star destroyers. An empire invited in through signed contracts and grateful handshakes. An empire that would thank them for their conquest right up until the moment they realized conquest had occurred. Aegis Corporation had its first client. The foundation was laid. Now came the careful work of building an empire that would never call itself one. The Quell system hung in space like a promise waiting to be kept. 3 planets orbited a yellow star, but only Quell Prime held significant population, 8 million workers spread across mining settlements that scarred the planet's rust-colored surface. From orbit, the world looked wounded, its valuable mineral deposits carved out in geometric precision that spoke of decades of industrial exploitation. Stan Edgar studied the planet from Aegis Corporation's newly commissioned flagship, the Arbitrator, a former Imperial light cruiser retrofitted and repainted in corporate gray and blue. The ship was smaller than a star destroyer, faster than most civilian vessels, and armed well enough to handle pirate threats without appearing militaristic. Perfect for a corporation that needed to project protection without intimidation. Quell's governing council approved the contract, Gideon reported, entering the observation deck where Stan watched their first conquest unfold peacefully below. Full 5-year term, with performance reviews every 6 months. Senator Voss delivered the signed authorization this morning. She actually read the contract before signing? Stan asked, though he already knew the answer. She did. Spent 3 days with her legal advisors reviewing every clause. They requested 7 modifications, all cosmetic. We agreed to 6 and convinced them the 7th was industry standard non-negotiable. Stan turned from the viewport, satisfaction settling into his expression. Which means when the dependency clauses activate in year 2, they'll have no legitimate complaint. They reviewed everything. They negotiated. They chose this. The contract was a masterpiece of legal entrapment disguised as partnership. Year 1 provided exactly what Quell needed. Security, stability, and protection at reasonable cost. Year 2 introduced infrastructure integration protocols that positioned Aegis Corporation systems as essential to planetary defense coordination. By year 3, removing Aegis would require replacing an entire network security apparatus at costs Quell's economy couldn't support. By year 5, the question wouldn't be whether to renew, it would be how much to expand services. The first patrol deployment launches in 2 hours, Gideon continued. I'm leading the initial operations personally. We need to demonstrate immediate effectiveness. Pirates hit a mining convoy last week, so we'll position forces along the convoy routes and ensure the next shipment proceeds without incident. Make it dramatic, Stan advised. Not just protection, rescue. Let a pirate attack begin, respond with overwhelming force, save the convoy with minimal casualties. You want holovid footage of Aegis Corporation ships arriving just in time. You want miners telling their families that the new corporate fleet saved their lives. Calculated heroism, Gideon said with that cold smile they shared. The Empire never understood theater's value in maintaining control. Grand Moff Tarkin believed fear kept systems in line, but fear requires constant reinforcement. Gratitude is self-sustaining. Vought's marketing department used to say, heroes are made in moments, but remembered in stories. We didn't just deploy superheroes. We ensured their deployments were recorded, edited, and broadcast with narrative structure that made people love them. You're not just defending Quell. You're creating the legend of Aegis Corporation's reliability. Gideon nodded, understanding translating into operational planning with military precision. I'll have media coordinators embedded with the patrol fleet. When we engage pirates, every angle gets recorded. When we rescue that convoy, the footage goes to every news network in the sector. And Senator Voss gets advanced notice, Stan added. She gets to break the good news to her constituents personally. She becomes associated with bringing Aegis Corporation to quell. Her political capital rises with our success. Which ensures her continued advocacy for our services. Gideon completed the calculation. She'll become our champion in the Senate, recommending Aegis to other struggling worlds because our success is her success. Stan returned to the viewport, watching Aegis Corporation's patrol craft launching from the arbitrator's hangar bay. They moved with military precision but bore none of the imperial aesthetics that triggered resistance. Corporate markings, professional pilots, legitimate defensive mission. Everything about the operation screamed legitimacy. There's another matter we need to discuss, Stan said. The cloning facilities on Kamino. You mentioned limited operational capacity. If we're building a corporate military force that can scale across multiple systems, we'll need personnel production that exceeds conventional recruitment. Gideon moved to stand beside him, their identical profiles reflected in the viewport's transparisteel. The Kaminoans were masters of accelerated growth and memory imprinting. What they accomplished with the Grand Army of the Republic, creating millions of trained soldiers in years rather than decades, would give Aegis Corporation an insurmountable advantage. But their facilities were damaged when the Empire turned on them. Much of their advanced technology was lost. But not all of it, Stan pressed. You said you have limited capacity. How limited? We can produce approximately 500 viable clones annually with current technology. Memory imprinting works for basic combat training and operational protocols. Accelerated growth allows maturation from embryo to combat-ready adult in roughly 18 months. But the Kaminoans' advanced techniques, the ones that created truly exceptional soldiers, those remain beyond our capability. Stan processed the numbers with the same efficiency he'd once applied to Compound V production quotas. 500 annually isn't enough for galactic expansion, but it's sufficient for our immediate needs. We use clones to fill specialized roles, elite security forces, tactical teams, operations that require complete loyalty and discretion. Conventional recruitment handles bulk security needs on client worlds. Exactly my assessment, Gideon agreed. And the clones provide another advantage, they're completely loyal. No political allegiances, no moral complications, no risk of defection to competitors or government agencies. They're manufactured assets, like droids but with human adaptability and initiative. We'll need to address the ethics concerns, Stan said, though his tone suggested procedure rather than principle. In my universe, Vought faced constant criticism about how we treated superhumans. The public eventually accepts necessary moral compromises if you frame them correctly. Cloning will face similar scrutiny. The Clone Wars already established precedent, Gideon noted. The Republic used clone soldiers for 3 years. Millions of them. The galaxy already accepted that clones could serve in military capacity. We're simply continuing established practice for private corporate security rather than governmental military. Frame it as providing employment opportunities for clones who'd otherwise have no purpose, Stan suggested. The war's over, but the clones still exist. We're giving them meaningful work, fair compensation, and purpose. It's rehabilitation, not exploitation. That's perfect, Gideon said. We're not creating clone soldiers, we're employing them. The fact that we're also producing them is secondary to the humanitarian framework. A communication signal interrupted their planning. Gideon accepted, and a holographic figure materialized. A quell mining foreman, his face lined with decades of hard labor and recent stress. Aegis Corporation, this is Foreman Kelby's, Convoy 7 Delta. We're under attack. 3 pirate interceptors, they've disabled our lead transport and they're the transmission dissolved into static, then screams, then weapon fire. Gideon moved immediately, all corporate pretense vanishing as military command took over. This is Commander Gideon to all patrol units. Convoy 7 Delta is under attack, coordinates transmitting now. Alpha and Beta wings, intercept immediately. I want those pirates neutralized and that convoy protected. Rules of engagement. Disable if possible, destroy if necessary. And somebody get me a direct holocom feed, I want this recorded. Stan watched the transformation with professional appreciation. This was why their partnership worked. Gideon could shift from corporate executive to military commander without hesitation, while Stan maintained strategic overview regardless of immediate tactical demands. Different skills, complementary purposes. The arbitrator's bridge erupted into controlled chaos as Gideon took command. Stan remained on the observation deck, watching through the tactical displays as Aegis patrol craft accelerated toward the coordinates. The pirates had chosen poorly. Attacking within hours of Aegis Corporation establishing presence suggested either remarkable stupidity or complete ignorance of the new security arrangement. Either way, they would provide exactly the demonstration Aegis needed. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. Aegis patrol craft emerged from hyperspace with precise coordination, immediately engaging the pirate interceptors with overwhelming firepower. 2 pirates attempted to flee, one made it to hyperspace, the other caught 3 precise turbolaser shots that disabled engines without destroying the ship. The third pirate, apparently more committed to their raid, continued attacking the convoy until Aegis fighters reduced their vessel to expanding debris. The holocom footage was perfect. Terrified miners watching death approach, then salvation arriving in clean corporate vessels. Aegis pilots communicating calm professionalism as they eliminated threats. The damaged convoy limping toward safety under corporate escort. And Foreman Kelby's voice shaking with relief and gratitude, thanking Aegis Corporation for saving their lives. Transmit that footage to every news network in the sector, Stan instructed the communications officer. And prepare a press statement from Commander Gideon expressing satisfaction that Aegis Corporation could fulfill its contracted obligation to protect Quell's citizens. Within 3 hours, the rescue was sector news. Within 6 hours, Senator Voss was giving interviews praising her decision to contract with Aegis Corporation. Within 12 hours, 3 neighboring systems had submitted formal inquiries about Aegis security services. The foundation was laid. The legend was beginning. And Quell had no idea they just welcomed the first piece of an empire that would eventually consume them. Stan and Gideon stood together in the arbitrator's command center that evening, watching news coverage of their carefully orchestrated heroism. The sector was grateful. Politicians were praising corporate initiative. And the New Republic Senate was quietly relieved that someone else was handling problems they couldn't solve. This is how empires should be built, Gideon said quietly. Not with star destroyers appearing over frightened worlds, but with grateful citizens requesting your protection. Vought controlled 70% of the American superhuman market within 20 years, Stan replied. We did it by making superhumans essential to daily life, disaster response, law enforcement support, infrastructure protection. People stopped asking whether we should have that much power and started asking how they'd survive without us. How long do you estimate until Aegis Corporation reaches similar market dominance in this galaxy? Stan considered the question with the same analytical precision he'd applied to every corporate expansion strategy. The New Republic controls thousands of systems, but they're stretched impossibly thin. Outer Rim worlds are desperate for security. Mid-Rim systems want economic stability. Even some core worlds are nervous about pirate activity and Imperial remnant threats. If we execute properly, demonstrate reliability, maintain competitive pricing, and avoid Imperial aesthetics that trigger resistance, we could have 50 client systems within 5 years. 200 within 10. At that point, we're not a corporation anymore. We're an institution. And institutions don't get eliminated, they get regulated, which means we participate in writing our own regulations. And by then, the cloning facilities will be fully operational, Gideon added. Producing thousands of loyal security forces annually. We'll have the largest private military in the galaxy, all operating under legitimate corporate contracts that no one can challenge without appearing to oppose private enterprise and local governance. There's still one significant threat to address, Stan said, pulling up a holographic file they'd both reviewed dozens of times. The armored Mandalorian. Din Djarin. He's cost you before. He represents exactly the kind of independent variable that can disrupt careful planning. And he has the Darksaber, a symbol that apparently matters to Mandalorian culture. Mandalorians are warriors without a current nation, Gideon said, frustration entering his usually controlled tone. Scattered across the galaxy after the Empire's purge. But they maintain cultural identity and warrior traditions that make them dangerous. Din Djarin specifically has become problematic. He rescued the child I was studying, a Force-sensitive specimen of tremendous potential. He destroyed my facility on Navarro. And he claimed the Darksaber, which according to Mandalorian tradition makes him a legitimate leader of their people. Then he's not a threat to eliminate, Stan said. He's a brand to manage. You said Mandalorians value symbols. The Darksaber is a symbol. This Mandalorian is becoming a symbol. Symbols are powerful, but they're also constraining. They have to live up to their legend, which makes them predictable. You're suggesting we don't fight him directly, Gideon said slowly, understanding dawning. We make him famous. We turn him into exactly what Mandalorian culture demands, a legendary warrior bound by honor and tradition. And then we exploit those constraints. Vought had the same problem with Homelander, Stan said. Most powerful superhuman alive, increasingly unstable, potential threat to everything we'd built. But he was also our most valuable asset. The symbol of superhuman heroism that justified our entire corporate existence. So we didn't fight him. We managed him. We gave him what he needed to feel powerful while ensuring he remained dependent on Vought for validation. And when he threatened to break free, we reminded him that without Vought, he wasn't a hero. He was just a dangerous freak the government would eliminate. The Mandalorian values protecting the child he rescued, Gideon said, tactical wheels turning. He values his armor and warrior code. He values Mandalorian cultural approval. Those aren't weaknesses, they're pressure points. Every person has something they value more than themselves, Stan agreed. Find that thing, and you don't need to destroy them. You just need to make them choose between what they value and opposing you. Most people make the predictable choice. Gideon smiled, that cold expression of calculated cruelty. I tried to take the child by force. It failed. But if circumstances arose where the child's safety depended on the Mandalorians' cooperation. That's thinking like a CEO instead of a military commander, Stan approved. Direct confrontation is expensive and risky. Leverage is efficient and predictable. They stood together, two identical strategists planning the exploitation of a warrior culture neither truly understood but both recognized as obstacles to overcome. The Mandalorian wouldn't know it yet, but his legend was about to become his prison. Below them, Quell celebrated its corporate saviors. News networks praised Aegis Corporation's rapid response and professional effectiveness. Senator Voss's approval ratings soared. And 3 more systems were drafting contracts that would invite Aegis Corporation into their essential infrastructure. The galaxy was learning to need them. Soon, it would learn it couldn't survive without them. And by the time anyone realized what Aegis Corporation had actually become, dismantling it would cause more damage than accepting it. Stan Edgar had built one empire in his universe. Now, with Moff Gideon's resources and identical ruthless clarity, he was building another. Not through conquest, but through contract. Not through fear, but through gratitude. It was perfect. It was insidious. And it was just beginning. The Mandalorian's ship, Razor Crest, had been destroyed months ago, but Djarin had acquired a replacement, a modified N-1 starfighter that sacrificed cargo capacity for speed and maneuverability. It streaked through hyperspace toward Kalevala, a Mandalorian world where Bo-Katan Kryze maintained her holdfast. Din needed answers about the Darksaber, about leadership he'd never sought, and about the child he'd returned to the Jedi but couldn't stop thinking about. He didn't know that his trajectory had already intersected with plans laid by two men who looked identical and thought in parallel. On the arbitrator, Stan Edgar reviewed intelligence reports with the detached efficiency that had made him Vought's most effective executive. The reports detailed Djarin's movements over the past year. The rescue of Grogu, the destruction of Gideon's facility, the acquisition of the Darksaber, and most recently, his return to Mandalorian space seeking guidance from Bo-Katan Kryze. The Mandalorians are fracturing, Gideon explained, pulling up holographic displays showing various Mandalorian factions scattered across the galaxy. Bo-Katan leads one faction, warriors who removed their helmets, embraced political engagement, and seek to reclaim Mandalore itself. Djarin belongs to a different sect, the Children of the Watch, religious fundamentalists who never remove their helmets and follow the way with absolute devotion. They view Bo-Katan's faction as heretics. Divided opposition, Stan observed. Exploitable. In my universe, Vought always benefited when superhuman factions fought each other instead of uniting against corporate control. When heroes competed for public approval, Vought mediated that competition and profited from all sides. Except the Darksaber complicates traditional Mandalorian divisions, Gideon continued. According to their culture, whoever wins it in combat becomes the rightful wielder. The rightful leader. Djarin defeated me and claimed it, which theoretically makes him a legitimate ruler whether he wants that responsibility or not. Stan studied the warrior's profile with clinical interest. He doesn't want political power. His psychological profile suggests someone who values personal freedom and direct action over systemic authority. He's a bounty hunter, not a politician. That's leverage. How do you propose we exploit it? By making leadership unavoidable, Stan said, strategy crystallizing with the clarity that had built Vought into an empire. He's trying to return the Darksaber to Bo-Katan because he doesn't want the responsibility. We ensure that attempting to avoid leadership creates consequences worse than accepting it. We make him choose between his desire for anonymity and protecting what he values. The child, Gideon said immediately. Grogu. He returned the specimen to the Jedi, but our intelligence suggests the attachment remains strong. The Mandalorian may have given up custody, but he hasn't abandoned the emotional connection. Then we create a situation where the child's safety depends on the Mandalorian's cooperation. Not direct threat, that would unite Mandalorians against us. Something more subtle. A crisis where Mandalorian leadership could prevent tragedy, and the only legitimate leader by their own cultural rules is Djarin. Gideon pulled up another display, this one showing Mandalore itself. The planet was a scarred wasteland, its surface devastated by Imperial bombardment during the Purge. Scattered Mandalorian survivors lived in underground settlements or had fled to other worlds. The great warrior culture that had once rivaled the Republic itself was reduced to fragmented clans arguing over tradition and survival. Mandalore's surface is toxic, Gideon explained. Bombardment released contaminants that made it uninhabitable. But our geological surveys suggest the damage isn't permanent. With sufficient resources and technology, the planet could be reclaimed within a decade. It would require massive investment, corporate expertise in environmental rehabilitation, and political will to coordinate scattered Mandalorian factions. Stan saw it immediately. The elegant trap that would ensnare Mandalorian cooperation while expanding Aegis Corporation's influence. We offer to rehabilitate Mandalore. Not as conquerors, but as contractors. Aegis Corporation has the resources, the technology, and the economic backing to restore their homeworld. We present it as corporate investment in regional stability. Helping a warrior culture reclaim their heritage benefits everyone by creating a strong, independent faction that can help maintain order in surrounding sectors. The New Republic would support it, Gideon agreed, excitement entering his usually controlled tone. They're desperate for regional powers that can self-govern effectively. Mandalorian restoration would reduce their burden while creating a buffer against Imperial remnants. They'd see it as diplomatic victory. And the Mandalorians would welcome it because we're offering them what they want most, their home back. But here's where it becomes leverage. We make the contract contingent on unified Mandalorian leadership. We can't invest billions of credits into rehabilitating a planet if the cultural group we're helping remains fractured and might collapse into civil war the moment we leave. They need a leader, Gideon completed the logic. Someone all factions can accept. Someone who won the Darksaber in legitimate combat and therefore has cultural authority that transcends factional divisions. Din Djarin, Stan said. Who doesn't want leadership but would accept it to give his people their homeworld back. Especially if the alternative is watching Mandalorian culture continue fragmenting into irrelevance. And once he accepts leadership, he's predictable. Leaders have responsibilities. They have to consider consequences. They can't simply act on personal conviction anymore. It's brilliant, Gideon admitted. We're not threatening him or his people. We're offering salvation. But salvation comes with strings. Strings that bind him into exactly the kind of systemic responsibility that constrains independent action. And once Mandalore is being rehabilitated under Aegis Corporation's management, we have legitimate presence in Mandalorian space. We're not occupiers, we're contractors providing essential services they requested. Within 5 years, Aegis infrastructure will be essential to Mandalore's continued habitability. They'll be dependent on us the same way Quell is becoming dependent. Another client system, another integration point, another step toward galactic ubiquity. Gideon pulled up financial projections. Mandalore rehabilitation would cost approximately 8 billion credits over 10 years. That's significant investment even for Aegis Corporation's current capital reserves. Which is why we don't fund it ourselves, Stan corrected. We create an investment consortium. New Republic contributes, they want regional stability. Mandalorian factions contribute what resources they can, buying into their own rehabilitation. We broker neutral investment from systems that benefit from stable Mandalorian presence. Aegis Corporation manages the project and takes a percentage, but the financial burden distributes across multiple stakeholders. We profit from management fees while everyone else pays for the actual work. That's remarkably efficient exploitation, Gideon said with something approaching admiration. It's what I did at Vought for 30 years. Find something people desperately want, offer to provide it, structure the deal so they pay for their own exploitation, and ensure they thank you for the opportunity. The best contracts are the ones where everyone believes they won. A communication alert interrupted their planning. The officer on duty reported with professional crispness, "Sirs, we're receiving a priority transmission from Senator Voss on Quell. She's requesting immediate conference." "Accepted," Gideon ordered. Senator Voss's holographic image materialized, and Stan immediately noted the tension in her posture. Something had shifted. The grateful politician who'd praised Aegis Corporation 6 weeks ago had been replaced by someone considerably more cautious. "Commander Gideon, Mr. Edgar," she began, formality replacing previous warmth. "I need to discuss some concerns that have emerged regarding our security contract." "Of course, Senator," Gideon replied smoothly. "Aegis Corporation values transparency with our clients. What concerns you?" "There's been talk, unsubstantiated, but concerning, about your organization's long-term intentions. Some council members are worried that Quell is becoming too dependent on Aegis systems. That our own defense forces are being gradually supplanted rather than supplemented. That the contract's renewal clauses contain provisions that make withdrawal complicated." There it was. The inevitable pushback that occurred in every corporate integration. The moment when clients realized the partnership they'd welcomed was more binding than they'd understood. Stan had navigated this crisis point dozens of times at Vought. The key was acknowledgement without apology, reframing without retreat. Senator, those are valid concerns, Stan interjected before Gideon could respond with military directness. Corporate partnerships always involve dependency trade-offs. You're dependent on Aegis security, yes, but Aegis is equally dependent on Quell's contract payments and reputation as our founding client. Mutual dependency is partnership's foundation. As for your own defense forces, our training protocols are designed to enhance their capability, not replace them. Would you like us to commission an independent audit of force readiness since Aegis' arrival? We're confident the data will show improvement. Voss hesitated. The offer of independent verification was disarming. That would be helpful, actually. Some council members specifically questioned whether our local forces maintain operational independence. We'll arrange it immediately, Gideon assured her. Senator, I understand that trust takes time to build, especially given my imperial background. But Aegis Corporation's entire business model depends on client satisfaction. Unhappy clients don't renew contracts, don't recommend our services to other worlds, and damage our reputation in ways that hurt our expansion. We succeed only if you succeed. That's not sentiment, it's business reality. I appreciate your understanding, Voss said, tension easing slightly. I'm not suggesting we terminate the contract. Aegis has performed exactly as promised, pirate attacks have dropped 78% since you arrived. But I need to address these concerns before they become political problems. Absolutely, Stan agreed. In fact, this presents an opportunity. If you'd like, we can hold a public forum on Quell where citizens can ask Aegis representatives direct questions about our operations, our long-term intentions, and our contract terms. Complete transparency. We have nothing to hide, and public engagement demonstrates respect for local governance. The suggestion was calculated perfectly. Offering transparency while controlling the narrative. Stan knew that public forums could be managed, that prepared representatives could address concerns without revealing strategic vulnerabilities, and that the gesture itself would satisfy most skeptics regardless of substantive answers provided. That's an excellent idea, Voss said, relief evident. I'll coordinate with the council and set something up within the next 2 weeks. After the transmission ended, Gideon turned to Stan with analytical appreciation. You defused that expertly. She arrived suspicious and left feeling heard and reassured. It's the same crisis Vought faced every time public opinion shifted against us, Stan explained. The mistake companies make is getting defensive. Defensiveness confirms suspicion. Instead, you acknowledge concerns, offer verification, and provide transparency that you've already prepared to manage. Senator Voss thinks she won concessions. Actually, we just gained opportunity to publicly reinforce our legitimacy while identifying which council members are potential problems. The public forum will let us see who asks challenging questions, Gideon realized. Who among Quell's leadership might become obstacles to deeper integration. Exactly. And once we know who the skeptics are, we can address them individually. Corporate consultation, personal reassurance, or if necessary, quiet investigation into whether they have interests that conflict with planetary well-being. There's always something that makes people cooperate. Gideon returned to the Mandalore rehabilitation projections, but Stan could see his mind working in parallel tracks, managing current crises while planning future expansion. It was the same cognitive pattern Stan employed, the ability to address immediate problems without losing strategic vision. The Mandalorian situation requires careful timing, Gideon said. We can't offer Mandalore rehabilitation until Aegis Corporation's legitimacy is firmly established. If we move too quickly, it looks like Imperial remnant manipulation. But if we wait too long, other factions might attempt their own rehabilitation efforts or Mandalorian culture fractures beyond recovery. 6 months, Stan estimated. We need Aegis managing security for at least 5 client systems with documented success. We need New Republic politicians advocating for our services. We need enough financial backing that Mandalore rehabilitation looks like natural corporate expansion rather than targeted manipulation. 6 months of careful development, then we approach Bo-Katan Kryze with an offer she can't refuse. And the Mandalorian? He'll hear about our offer through Mandalorian networks. He'll be skeptical, everything in his profile suggests distrust of authority and corporate structures. But when he realizes that Mandalorian restoration is actually possible, that his people could reclaim their homeworld, he'll investigate. And when he investigates, we'll be ready with exactly the narrative that makes accepting leadership seem like the only honorable choice. A tactical alert interrupted their planning. One of Aegis Corporation's patrol groups had encountered something unexpected near Quell's outer system. Gideon pulled up the report, and both men studied the sensor data with sharp interest. That's an Imperial probe droid, Gideon identified immediately. Old design, but functional. Someone surveying our operations. Imperial remnant? Stan asked. Possibly. Or New Republic intelligence testing whether our corporate security is actually disguised Imperial resurgence. Or competitors assessing our capabilities. Or, Gideon paused, pulling up enhanced sensor analysis. Or Mandalorians investigating the new corporate power operating in their sector. Let it complete its surveillance, Stan decided. We have nothing to hide, officially. Our operations are legitimate, our contracts are legal, and our success is documented. Whoever sent that probe will see exactly what we want them to see, professional corporate security operating with client consent. It actually helps our legitimacy if multiple factions investigate us and find nothing actionable. Transparent exploitation, Gideon said. Show them everything because what we're doing isn't technically illegal, just strategically dangerous to their independence. The most effective control is the kind people choose, Stan agreed. And choice requires information. Let them investigate. Let them find a legitimate corporation providing valuable services. By the time they realize what we're building, too many systems will depend on us to allow interference. They watched the probe droid complete its scan and jump to hyperspace, carrying data back to whoever had deployed it. Somewhere, someone was analyzing Aegis Corporation's operations, trying to determine if they represented threat or opportunity. Stan hoped they concluded opportunity. Those were always easier to exploit. The Mandalorian situation, the Quell skepticism, the probe droid surveillance, all of it was manageable. All of it fit into patterns Stan had navigated for decades. Opposition was inevitable in any corporate expansion. The key was ensuring that opposition remained fragmented, skeptical rather than certain, and always one step behind strategic development. Aegis Corporation was growing exactly as planned. Within months, they'd be essential to dozens of systems. Within years, they'd be an institution the galaxy couldn't function without. And by the time anyone realized they'd invited in something more dangerous than the Empire ever was, it would be far too late. Stan Edgar had never failed to build the empire he envisioned. This galaxy would be no exception. The Darksaber hummed with an energy Djarin didn't fully understand. The ancient weapon hung heavy on his belt, not from physical weight, but from the burden of what it represented. Leadership. Responsibility. A destiny he'd never sought and didn't want. Bo-Katan Kryze stood across from him in her holdfast on Kalevala, her expression mixing frustration with grudging respect. She'd spent years trying to reclaim the Darksaber, to unite Mandalorian factions under her leadership, to restore their people's glory. And this religious zealot who never removed his helmet had accidentally acquired it by defeating an Imperial Moff. You can't just give it to me, Bo-Katan said, not for the first time. That's not how this works, Djarin. The Darksaber must be won in combat. That's our way. That's always been our way. Then we fight, Din said simply. I defeat you, you defeat me, either way the Darksaber goes where it should, to someone who actually wants to lead. It doesn't work like that either, Bo-Katan replied, her patience clearly tested. If you surrender, if you throw the fight, it means nothing. The Darksaber would still recognize you as the rightful wielder. Intent matters. Combat must be genuine, victory must be earned, or the weapon remains bound to its current owner. Din wanted to throw the cursed thing into the nearest sun. He was a bounty hunter. He understood credits, contracts, and the straightforward morality of the hunt. He didn't understand ancient weapons with cultural significance, factional politics, or the weight of leadership he'd never wanted. There has to be another way, Din insisted. There isn't, Bo-Katan said flatly. You're stuck with it. And whether you like it or not, that makes you relevant to Mandalore's future. Every clan, every faction, every warrior culture adherent will have an opinion about the bounty hunter who accidentally became a potential leader. Before Din could respond, an alert chimed through the holdfast systems. Bo-Katan pulled up a holographic display, and her expression shifted to something between interest and suspicion. This is unexpected, she said, studying the transmission. It's from a corporation called Aegis. They're requesting formal negotiation with Mandalorian leadership regarding a proposal of mutual benefit and cultural significance. Mandalorians don't negotiate with corporations, Din said immediately, his distrust of such entities bone deep. Mandalorians negotiate with anyone who might help us survive, Bo-Katan corrected. We're scattered, broken, and homeless, Din Djarin. Our pride doesn't feed our children or reclaim our world. At least hear what they're offering. The holographic display expanded, showing two men, identical in appearance, standing in what appeared to be a corporate command center. One wore civilian business attire that somehow suggested military precision. The other wore an imperial officer's uniform that Din recognized with instant hostility. That's Moff Gideon, Din said, his hand moving toward his blaster. He tried to take Grogu. He's the reason. I know who he is, Bo-Katan interrupted, her own expression hardening. He led the purge of Mandalore. He's responsible for our world's devastation and the deaths of thousands of our people. But he's not transmitting from an Imperial Star Destroyer. He's with some kind of corporate entity, and that uniform looks wrong for active Imperial service. Din studied the other figure, the one who wasn't Gideon but looked exactly like him. Something about the man's posture suggested he was even more dangerous than the Moff, though Din couldn't articulate why. It was the same instinct that had kept him alive through countless hunts, the recognition of a predator who didn't need weapons to be deadly. Lady Bo-Katan cries, the man who wasn't Gideon began, his voice carrying calculated respect. My name is Stan Edgar, Strategic Director of Aegis Corporation. My colleague is former Moff Gideon, now serving as our operational commander. We understand our appearance is unusual, and that Moff Gideon's presence carries justified hostility. But we're approaching you with a proposal that we believe could change Mandalore's future. I'm listening, Bo-Katan said, her tone neutral but her stance tense. Din noticed her hand resting near her own weapon. Stan Edgar continued with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to negotiating hostile audiences. Aegis Corporation specializes in planetary security and infrastructure rehabilitation. Over the past 3 months, we've successfully established operations on 7 worlds, reducing pirate activity by an average of 73% and improving economic stability across all client systems. Our methods are proven, our resources are substantial, and our interest in regional stability is genuine. Get to the point, Bo-Katan demanded. Why are you contacting Mandalorian leadership? Gideon stepped forward, and Din's hand tightened on his blaster grip. Because Aegis Corporation has the capability to rehabilitate Mandalore. To make your homeworld habitable again. To give your people what they've wanted since the Purge, their planet back. The words hung in the air like a detonator waiting to explode. Din saw Bo-Katan's expression shift through disbelief, hope, and immediate suspicion in rapid succession. That's impossible, she said finally. Mandalore's surface is toxic. Imperial bombardment released contaminants that made it uninhabitable for generations. Every analysis says rehabilitation would take centuries and resources beyond any single organization's capability. Every analysis is wrong, Stan Edgar replied, pulling up geological surveys and environmental data. Imperial bombardment was devastating, yes, but not permanent. The contamination is severe but reversible with appropriate technology and sustained investment. Our preliminary estimates suggest Mandalore could be restored to habitability within 10 years, possibly less if Mandalorian factions cooperate fully with rehabilitation efforts. And what do you want in exchange? Bo-Katan asked, her skepticism clear. Corporations don't invest billions of credits out of cultural appreciation. What's the real cost? 3 things, Stan Edgar said, his directness somehow more disturbing than deception would have been. First, unified Mandalorian leadership. We can't invest in rehabilitating a planet if the cultural group claiming it remains fractured and might collapse into civil war. Second, a security partnership. Once Mandalore is habitable, Aegis Corporation maintains contracted presence to ensure stability during reconstruction. Third, Mandalorian cultural consultation on regional security matters, your warrior expertise applied to maintaining order in surrounding sectors. You want us dependent on your corporation, Bo-Katan said flatly. We want mutual dependency, Stan corrected. Aegis invests resources and expertise. Mandalorians provide cultural legitimacy and warrior tradition that enhances our reputation. Both parties benefit. Both parties need each other. That's partnership, not exploitation. Din had heard enough. This is a trap. Gideon tried to take Grogu, tried to use him for experiments. Now he's offering Mandalore back. It's manipulation. He wants something else. Gideon met Din's hostile stare without flinching. You're right to distrust me, Mandalorian. My actions during Imperial service were ruthless. I make no apologies. But circumstances change. The Empire fell. I could have continued pursuing Imperial restoration through military force, there are enough remnant factions doing exactly that. Instead, I chose a different path. Aegis Corporation represents something new, security through economic integration rather than military occupation. I can't undo what I did to Mandalore, but I can help restore it. If that serves my corporate interests while also serving yours, both parties benefit. Why unified leadership? Bo-Katan pressed, returning to Stan Edgar's conditions. Mandalorian factions have operated independently for years. Why does Aegis care about our internal politics? Because corporate investment requires stability, Stan replied. If we invest 8 billion credits into Mandalore's rehabilitation and Mandalorian factions immediately fracture into civil war over who controls the restored planet, we lose everything. Unity isn't about controlling you, it's about protecting our investment and ensuring the project succeeds. And who decides who leads United Mandalorians? Din asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Stan Edgar's gaze shifted to him with predatory precision. According to Mandalorian tradition, the wielder of the Darksaber is the rightful ruler. You defeated Moff Gideon in combat. You claimed the blade. By your culture's own rules, you're the legitimate leader, whether you want that responsibility or not. No, Din said immediately. I don't want leadership. I'm a bounty hunter, not a ruler. What you want is irrelevant, Bo-Katan said quietly, and Din heard something in her voice he'd rarely heard, respect mixed with resignation. Stan Edgar is right. You won the Darksaber fairly. Every Mandalorian faction will acknowledge that legitimacy, even if they disagree on everything else. You're the only leader we could all accept. I won't do it, Din insisted. Find another way. There is no other way, Stan Edgar said, his tone carrying absolute certainty. Without unified leadership, Aegis Corporation won't invest in Mandalore's rehabilitation. Without that investment, your homeworld remains toxic and uninhabitable. Your people remain scattered, your culture continues fragmenting, and within a generation, Mandalorian civilization becomes a historical footnote rather than a living culture. The choice is yours, Din Djarin. Accept leadership you don't want and give your people their world back, or maintain personal freedom while watching everything Mandalorians value slowly disappear. Din felt the trap closing around him with the inevitability of gravity. This was manipulation. He knew it. Bo-Katan knew it. But the offer was real. Mandalore could be restored. His people could go home. All it required was accepting a burden he'd never sought and didn't want. How long do we have to consider this proposal? Bo-Katan asked, her strategic mind already calculating implications. 6 months, Gideon replied. Aegis Corporation needs to establish broader legitimacy before undertaking a project of Mandalore scale. During that time, we'll continue our current operations, demonstrate our reliability, and secure the financial backing and political support necessary for rehabilitation. In 6 months, we'll formalize the proposal. If Mandalorian leadership, unified leadership, accepts our terms, we begin immediately. If not, the offer expires and we redirect resources to other opportunities. 6 months, Bo-Katan repeated, looking at Din. That gives us time to verify their claims, assess their operations, and determine if this is genuine opportunity or elaborate trap. It's both, Din said quietly. Every instinct says they're dangerous. But that doesn't make the offer false. Stan Edgar smiled. A cold expression that reminded Din uncomfortably of the corporate predators who'd exploited Outer Rim worlds for generations. You're perceptive, Mandalorian. Yes, we're dangerous. Yes, accepting our proposal creates dependency. But the alternative is watching your culture die slowly while maintaining ideological purity. I've spent my career understanding that sometimes the choice isn't between good options and bad options, it's between bad options and worse options. Aegis Corporation is a bad option. Mandalorian extinction is worse. The transmission ended, leaving Din and Bo-Katan staring at the space where their identical faces had been. The holdfast felt suddenly smaller, the weight of impossible choices pressing down like Mandalore's toxic atmosphere. We need to investigate them, Bo-Katan said finally. Every operation, every contract, every world they've established presence on. If they're legitimate, if this is real, then we have to consider it seriously. And if it's a trap? Din asked. Then we spring it knowingly, with full awareness of the risks, because the potential reward is our homeworld. Bo-Katan moved to the viewport, looking out at stars that held no planet Mandalorians could call home. I've spent years trying to unite our people, Din Djarin. I've failed repeatedly because every faction has different priorities, different traditions, different visions of what Mandalore should be. But all of us want one thing, to go home. If Aegis Corporation can actually deliver that, I'll negotiate with them regardless of personal cost. Din looked at the Darksaber hanging from his belt. The weapon that made him relevant to decisions he'd never wanted to make. The symbol of leadership he'd accidentally claimed. The cultural weight that transformed a simple bounty hunter into someone responsible for an entire civilization's future. I won't lead them, Din said quietly. You may not have a choice, Bo-Katan replied. Because if the alternative is watching Mandalore remain dead while we fragment into irrelevance, you'll accept leadership. Not because you want it. Because it's the only honorable option remaining. Din said nothing, because he suspected she was right. And that realization felt like a trap closing with perfect precision, exactly as Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon had designed. 6 months. 6 months to investigate, to verify, to prepare. 6 months before Din Djarin would have to choose between personal freedom and cultural responsibility. He suspected he already knew which choice he'd make. And he hated that these two corporate predators had understood him well enough to engineer exactly this situation. This is the way, he thought bitterly. Except the way had never included corporate negotiations and strategic manipulation. The way was supposed to be simple: honor, combat, protection of the vulnerable. Not impossible choices between bad options and worse ones. But the galaxy had never cared about what the way was supposed to be. It only cared about what actually worked. And Din was beginning to understand that sometimes what worked looked nothing like honor. It looked like compromise, calculation, and accepting help from enemies because the alternative was unacceptable. Mandalore could be restored. His people could go home. All it required was everything Din Djarin had spent his life avoiding: leadership, politics, and trusting people he knew were dangerous. This is the way, he thought again. But this time, the words felt like a chain rather than a code. The New Republic Intelligence Service operated from a nondescript building on Hosnian Prime, deliberately understated compared to the Grand Senate chambers and diplomatic towers that dominated the capital's skyline. Marshal Cara Dune had joined the service 6 months ago, trading the relative simplicity of frontier law enforcement for the complexity of galactic intelligence work. She'd been recommended by her former associate, the Mandalorian bounty hunter Din Djarin, and her combat experience during the rebellion made her valuable for field operations. Currently, she was reviewing intelligence reports on something that bothered her more with each passing week: Aegis Corporation. "It's too clean," she said, gesturing at the holographic displays surrounding her workspace. Her partner, a Dracelian intelligence analyst named Corin, looked up from his own terminal with weary agreement. "That's what concerns Director Voss as well," Corin replied. Director Voss was no relation to Senator Voss of Quell, unfortunate naming coincidence that caused regular confusion in their reports. 12 client systems in 4 months. Perfect operational record. Not a single contract dispute, not one client complaint, stellar security performance across all deployments. Corporations this effective don't exist without cutting corners somewhere. Kara studied the financial data streams, the security performance metrics, the client satisfaction surveys. Every indicator suggested Aegis Corporation was exactly what it claimed: a professional security provider delivering valuable services at competitive prices. But her instincts, honed through years of combat and survival, screamed that something was wrong. "Run through the leadership again," she requested. Corin pulled up personnel files. 2 primary executives. Moff Gideon, former Imperial officer, confirmed involvement in Mandalore's purge, disappeared after the Empire's collapse. Resurfaced 8 months ago as founder of Aegis Corporation. Clean corporate registration, no outstanding Imperial warrants, technically legal civilian status. And the other one? Stan Edgar. Corporate strategist, lists extensive business experience in. Corin paused, frowning at his display. That's odd. His corporate history checks out on paper, but the deeper I dig, the more it feels manufactured. Companies he claims to have worked for exist, documentation confirms his employment, but there's no personal detail. No holonet presence before Aegis Corporation. No family records, no educational background that leads anywhere substantial. It's as if he appeared fully formed as a corporate executive without any of the normal biographical data that accumulates around a person over decades. Could be witness protection, Kara suggested. Someone who needed a new identity. Or someone who isn't from this galaxy at all, Corin said quietly, pulling up classified reports from 8 months ago. Remember the dimensional breach detected near Gideon's last known Imperial facility? The one that released an energy signature our scientists couldn't identify. Timeline matches exactly with Stan Edgar's sudden appearance in galactic records. Kara leaned forward, interest sharpening. You're suggesting he's from another universe? That's theoretical physics speculation, not actionable intelligence. Except Gideon was conducting research into dimensional energy at that facility before the Mandalorian destroyed it. And except Stan Edgar has no verifiable history before that exact moment. And except these 2 men look absolutely identical, which everyone assumes is cloning, but what if it's not? What if they're the same person from different realities? Kara paused, considering implications. Actually, that would explain a lot. Why their strategic thinking is so aligned. Why they work together with zero apparent conflict despite both being obvious alphas accustomed to command. They're not competing because they're essentially the same mind in two bodies. It's speculation, Corin admitted. But it's the only explanation that makes sense of the data. And if I'm right, it means we're dealing with someone who understands corporate manipulation from a completely different universe. Someone whose strategies might not follow patterns we predict based on galactic precedent. Kara pulled up Aegis Corporation's recent proposal to Mandalorian leadership. The intelligence service had intercepted the communication, routine surveillance on known Imperial remnant figures like Gideon. What she read made her blood run cold with recognition of elegant strategic entrapment. They're offering to rehabilitate Mandalore, she said slowly. Using Din Djarin's possession of the Darksaber as leverage to force unified Mandalorian leadership. It's brilliant. It's horrifying. It's exactly the kind of manipulation that creates dependency while looking like humanitarian assistance. The director wants to know if we should intervene, Corin said. Aegis Corporation hasn't broken any laws. Their operations are legitimate, their contracts are legal, and their clients are genuinely satisfied. But the pattern suggests something dangerous building beneath the surface. Kara thought about Din Djarin, her former associate and friend. The Mandalorian was many things: skilled warrior, competent bounty hunter, fiercely protective of those he cared about, but he was not a politician or strategist. If Gideon and Edgar were manipulating him into accepting Mandalorian leadership, Din wouldn't see the trap until it had already closed. I need to warn him, Kara decided. Personal contact, off the intelligence grid. If Mandalorians are walking into corporate dependency, they deserve to know what they're actually accepting. The director won't approve that, Corin warned. Official policy is observation without intervention unless laws are violated. Then I take personal leave and contact an old associate unofficially, Kara replied. Din Djarin saved my life on Navarro. I owe him better than watching silently while he's manipulated into a trap. Corin studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll note in the official record that you're taking personal time. What you do during that time is your own business. Kara appreciated the discretion. Intelligence work involved navigating gray areas between official procedure and practical necessity. Sometimes the right action couldn't wait for bureaucratic approval. She transmitted a coded message to Din Djarin's known communication frequencies, requesting a meeting on neutral ground. The response came within hours, coordinates for a remote station in the Outer Rim, 3 days hence. Typical Mandalorian caution, she thought with grim approval. Din didn't trust easy communications or convenient locations. The station was barely more than a refueling depot serving freighter traffic between major hyperspace routes. Kara arrived in a civilian transport, armed but not obviously so, and found Din waiting in a maintenance bay his ship occupied. The Mandalorian's new starfighter was an impressive piece of hardware, fast, maneuverable, and heavily modified beyond standard specifications. Kara, Din greeted her, his voice filtered through the helmet he never removed. Your message suggested urgency. It is urgent, Kara confirmed, checking to ensure they were alone. I'm with New Republic Intelligence now. Part of my work involves monitoring potential security threats. And Din, your name has come up in connection with something that concerns me deeply. Aegis Corporation, Din said immediately. You're investigating them. We are. And what we're finding is complicated. On the surface, they're exactly what they claim, professional security provider with legitimate operations. But underneath, there are patterns that suggest something much more dangerous. Kara pulled up her personal datapad, showing intelligence summaries she technically shouldn't have removed from secure facilities. Din studied them with the focus of someone accustomed to evaluating threats quickly. Stan Edgar has no history before appearing with Gideon 8 months ago, Kara explained. We think he might be from another universe. Arrived through some kind of dimensional breach that Gideon was researching. If true, it means we're dealing with corporate strategies from beyond our galaxy's experience. I know they're manipulating the Mandalore situation, Din said quietly. Bo-Katan and I both recognize it. But the offer is real, Kara. They can actually restore Mandalore. Every analysis confirms it. The manipulation doesn't change the fact that they're offering something no one else can provide. That's how the best traps work, Kara replied. They offer something genuine, something you desperately need, and the cost doesn't become apparent until you're already committed. Din, these men are dangerous. Gideon led the purge of Mandalore. Edgar appears to be some kind of corporate strategist from another reality with expertise in exploiting superhuman assets, whatever that means in his universe. Together, they're building something that looks like helpful private security but could become something much worse. I know, Din said, and Kara heard something in his voice she'd rarely encountered, uncertainty mixed with resignation. But what choice do I have? Refuse their offer and watch Mandalore remain toxic. Let Mandalorian culture continue fragmenting while maintaining ideological purity. They're right about one thing, sometimes the choice isn't between good options and bad options. It's between bad options and worse options. You're considering accepting leadership, Kara realized. Bo-Katan says I have no choice. The Darksaber makes me legitimate by Mandalorian tradition. Every faction could accept my authority even if they disagree on everything else. If I refuse, Mandalore stays dead. If I accept, my people get their world back, but we become dependent on Aegis Corporation's management. It's a trap. I know it's a trap. But the alternative is unacceptable. Kara sat beside him on the landing ramp of his ship, two veterans of impossible conflicts facing another impossible choice. There might be a third option. What if the New Republic offers to rehabilitate Mandalore instead? Government-sponsored restoration rather than corporate contract. Din laughed bitterly. The New Republic can't protect Outer Rim systems from pirates, can't maintain adequate defense forces, and debates every decision through committee consensus that takes months to resolve. You think they could manage a decade-long planetary rehabilitation project? They'd promise help, form committees to study the issue, debate funding allocations for years, and ultimately accomplish nothing while Mandalorians continue suffering. You're probably right, Kara admitted. But Din, once you accept Aegis Corporation's help, you're committed. Corporate contracts aren't like bounty agreements, they don't end cleanly. There will be clauses, dependencies, renewal requirements. Within a few years, Mandalore might be habitable, but you'll be so integrated with Aegis systems that removing them would cause collapse. Then we build our own capability while using theirs, Din said, strategy forming even as he spoke. Accept their rehabilitation assistance, but demand Mandalorian participation in every phase. Learn their techniques, train our people, develop independent expertise. Use the 6 months before the formal agreement to prepare. Make the dependency temporary rather than permanent. Can you do that? Kara asked. Can Mandalorian factions cooperate enough to build that kind of independent capability while accepting corporate assistance? I don't know, Din admitted. But it's the only option that gives us both Mandalore's restoration and eventual independence. It requires accepting leadership I don't want, negotiating with enemies I don't trust, and gambling that Mandalorian warriors can learn corporate systems fast enough to avoid permanent dependency. Kara pulled up additional intelligence files. Aegis Corporation's contracts with their 12 client systems, detailed analysis of their operational patterns, and most concerning, evidence that those contracts contained clauses that made withdrawal increasingly complicated over time. Look at Quell, she said, highlighting specific contract provisions. They've been with Aegis for 4 months. Already, Aegis systems are integrated into their planetary defense network, their communication infrastructure, their security coordination. Technically, Quell could terminate the contract, but doing so would create immediate vulnerabilities that pirates would exploit within days. The dependency is already built in. Then we don't follow Quell's model, Din said firmly. We demand different contract terms. Mandalorian oversight at every level, technology transfer requirements, training protocols that develop our independent capability. Make corporate assistance conditional on genuine partnership rather than dependency. Gideon and Edgar won't agree to that, Kara warned. Their entire business model depends on creating dependency. Then they don't get Mandalore, Din replied. But I think they'll negotiate. They need Mandalorian legitimacy as much as we need their resources. A corporate security force with Mandalorian cultural endorsement would be far more valuable than one viewed as exploitative outsiders. That's leverage, Kara. Maybe the only leverage we have. Kara studied her friend. This Mandalorian bounty hunter being forced into galactic politics and corporate negotiations. Part of her wanted to protect him from what was coming. Part of her recognized that Din Djarin was more capable than his humble self-assessment suggested. He defeated Gideon once, rescued a Force-sensitive child from Imperial remnants, and survived threats that would have killed most warriors. If anyone could navigate corporate manipulation while maintaining Mandalorian independence, it might be him. I can't officially help you, Kara said carefully. New Republic intelligence doesn't interfere with legitimate corporate operations. But unofficially, as a friend, I can provide intelligence analysis on Aegis Corporation. Detailed contract assessments, operational patterns, strategic vulnerabilities. Information that might help you negotiate better terms. I'd appreciate that, Din said. Because I'm a bounty hunter, not a politician. I know combat, tracking, and survival. I don't know corporate negotiation or contract law. Then we find people who do, Kara suggested. Mandalorians aren't just warriors. You have engineers, traders, administrators. Build a negotiating team that can match Gideon and Edgar's corporate expertise. Don't face them alone. Din nodded slowly, the helmet hiding his expression but his posture suggesting relief at having some kind of plan. 6 months. That's how long we have to prepare. Can you provide intelligence support during that time? Unofficially, yes. I'll compile everything New Republic intelligence has on Aegis Corporation and transmit it through secure channels. No official attribution, just raw intelligence that might help you understand what you're actually negotiating with. Thank you, Kara. For the warning. For the help. For caring enough to risk your position. You saved my life on Navarro, Kara reminded him. I'm just returning the favor. But Din, be careful. These men are dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with combat capability. They're strategists who think in systems rather than individuals. They've built corporate empires, possibly across multiple universes. Facing them requires different skills than facing warriors or criminals. I know, Din said quietly. And I'm terrified I'm not capable of the kind of leadership they're forcing me into. But I don't have a choice. My people need Mandalore. And if accepting leadership is the price of giving them their world back, then I'll pay it. Kara stood, preparing to return to her transport. The galaxy is changing, Din. The New Republic isn't strong enough to maintain order. Imperial remnants are scattered but still dangerous. And now corporate forces like Aegis are filling the vacuum with private security that might become something much worse. You're caught in the middle of something bigger than Mandalorian restoration. I know, Din agreed. But all I can control is what I do. And what I do is protect my people, no matter the personal cost. They parted with the respect of veterans who understood sacrifice as necessity. Kara returned to Hosnian Prime and her intelligence work, compiling data that couldn't officially exist but might save Mandalorian independence. Din returned to Mandalorian space and the impossible task of uniting fractured factions under leadership he'd never sought. 6 months. 6 months to prepare for negotiations with enemies who'd spent decades perfecting corporate exploitation. 6 months to build capability that might preserve Mandalorian independence while accepting assistance they desperately needed. Din Djarin looked at the Darksaber hanging from his belt and wondered if ancient Mandalorian warriors had ever faced choices this complicated. Probably, he decided. Every generation thought their challenges were unprecedented. But the principles remained constant: honor, protection, sacrifice. This is the way, he thought. Even when the way led through corporate negotiations and strategic manipulation. Even when the way required accepting leadership from enemies to save your people. The path wasn't simple anymore. But it never really had been. That was just the comfortable lie warriors told themselves while following codes that made impossible choices seem clear. Mandalore would be restored. His people would go home. And Din Djarin would become the leader they needed, whether he wanted that burden or not. Because sometimes the way required everything you had to give. And sometimes, that included sacrificing the person you'd been to become the person your people needed. The cloning facility on Kamino rose from storm-racked oceans like a monument to hubris and scientific achievement. Stan Edgar walked its corridors with clinical interest, observing the Kaminoans' elegant architecture now repurposed for Aegis Corporation's personnel production. The tall, graceful beings who'd once created the Grand Army of the Republic had been reduced to contracted technicians, their independence stripped by imperial occupation and now maintained through corporate employment. It was, Stan reflected, a perfect metaphor for what Aegis Corporation was building across the galaxy. Production capacity has increased 17% since we implemented the new protocols, the lead Kaminoan scientist reported, her elongated neck craning to meet Stan's gaze. We can now produce 600 viable clones annually with full memory imprinting and accelerated maturation. At current growth rates, we'll reach 1,000 annually within 18 months. And quality control? Stan asked, studying tanks where clone soldiers grew in accelerated gestation. Minimal degradation. The Jango Fett template remains stable across generations. Combat effectiveness testing shows our clones performing at 94% of the original template's capability. For mass production security forces, this is exceptional quality. Stan nodded, satisfied. 1,000 loyal soldiers annually, each trained and memory imprinted with tactical expertise, each completely dedicated to Aegis Corporation because they literally had no other existence. It wasn't the superhuman production scale Vought had achieved with Compound V, but it was sustainable, predictable, and most importantly, legal within New Republic jurisdiction. Gideon joined him in the observation gallery, fresh from coordinating their latest client acquisition. A mid-rim system that had specifically requested Aegis services after seeing their performance on Quell. 15 client systems now, with another dozen in negotiation. The expansion was accelerating exactly as planned. The Mandalorian situation is developing, Gideon reported. Our intelligence indicates Din Djarin has been meeting with various Mandalorian factions, attempting to build consensus around accepting our proposal. He's also been in contact with New Republic intelligence. Specifically, Marshal Cara Dune. Expected, Stan said calmly. He's doing exactly what a competent leader would do, gathering information, consulting allies, preparing negotiating positions. The question is whether his preparations will be adequate. He's building a negotiating team, Gideon continued. Mandalorian engineers, traders, legal consultants. They're analyzing our standard contracts and identifying dependency clauses. They're preparing counterproposals that would require technology transfer and training protocols. Also expected, Stan replied. And I'm concerned they might negotiate terms that reduce our long-term control. If we agree to genuine technology transfer, Mandalorians could develop independent capability within years rather than decades. That undermines the dependency model that makes Aegis Corporation's integration sustainable. Stan turned from the cloning tanks to face his doppelganger directly. You're thinking like a military commander again. Territory held is territory controlled. But corporate integration works differently. We don't need absolute control, we need sufficient integration that removing us causes more problems than accepting us. Even if Mandalorians develop independent capability, they'll still need our systems for years during that development. And by the time they're truly independent, we'll be so embedded in surrounding sectors that Mandalorian autonomy doesn't threaten our broader strategy. You'd give them what they're asking for? Gideon said, surprise evident. I'd negotiate, Stan corrected. We give them technology transfer, but at implementation speeds that ensure dependency during the critical rehabilitation phase. We provide training protocols, but structured so Mandalorian expertise develops gradually while Aegis maintains operational control. We accept oversight requirements, but with contractual provisions that make that oversight advisory rather than authoritative. They think they're negotiating independence. Actually, they're negotiating the terms of their integration. That's remarkably sophisticated exploitation, Gideon observed. It's what Vought did with governmental oversight for 30 years. Every time Congress or regulatory agencies demanded more control over superhuman management, we negotiated agreements that looked like accountability but actually reinforced our autonomy. The key is giving opponents what they think they want while ensuring what they actually get serves your interests. Gideon pulled up a holographic display showing Mandalorian faction distributions across the galaxy. Hundreds of clans scattered across dozens of systems, each maintaining cultural identity while lacking unified political structure. It was exactly the kind of fragmented opposition that corporate strategy could exploit. There's another complication, Gideon said. Bo-Katan Kryze is more experienced with political negotiation than Din Djarin. She's advising him, and she's considerably more skeptical of our intentions. If she convinces Mandalorian factions to reject our proposal entirely, we lose the legitimacy benefit Mandalorian partnership would provide. Then we address Bo-Katan directly, Stan decided. Not through formal negotiation, through personal appeal. She's spent years trying to unite Mandalorians and restore Mandalore. She's failed repeatedly because she lacks resources and because factional divisions are too deep. We offer her what she's always wanted, the means to actually accomplish her goals. The cost is accepting corporate partnership she distrusts. The benefit is achieving everything she's dedicated her life to pursuing. That's leverage. She'll see it as manipulation, Gideon warned. Of course she will. She's not stupid. But seeing manipulation doesn't mean you can refuse what's offered when the alternative is watching everything you value slowly die. Bo-Katan will accept our terms because she's pragmatic enough to recognize that principled failure accomplishes nothing. A communication alert interrupted their planning, priority transmission from one of their client systems. Gideon accepted, and Senator Voss's holographic image appeared, her expression carrying urgency that immediately focused both men's attention. Commander Gideon, Mr. Edgar, we have a situation on Quell that requires immediate discussion. What's happened, Senator? Stan asked, his tone professionally concerned. Pirates attacked one of our outer settlements. Aegis forces responded as contracted, but, she paused, clearly uncomfortable. The engagement resulted in 37 civilian casualties. Your forces destroyed the pirates, but the collateral damage was severe. There are questions about whether the response was proportionate. Stan and Gideon exchanged glances. This was the inevitable crisis that occurred in any security operation. Civilian casualties, proportionality debates, and the challenge of maintaining public support when protection creates its own costs. We'll conduct a full investigation, Gideon said immediately. If our forces used excessive force or failed to adequately protect civilians, we'll implement corrective measures and provide appropriate compensation. The investigation is already underway, Voss replied. Quell's governing council is conducting it independently. But there's political pressure to reconsider our contract with Aegis. Some council members are arguing that corporate security prioritizes asset protection over civilian safety. Senator, may I speak candidly? Stan interjected, shifting to the tone he'd used countless times when Vought faced similar crises. Security operations in hostile environments always involve tragic trade-offs. Pirates attacked your settlement. Aegis forces engaged to eliminate that threat. Civilians died. And that's genuinely tragic. But the alternative was allowing pirates to continue their attack, which would have resulted in even more casualties. Our forces made split-second decisions under combat conditions. Should we review those decisions and improve protocols? Absolutely. Should we allow one tragic incident to invalidate 4 months of successful protection that has saved countless lives? That requires more careful consideration. Voss's expression suggested she understood the logic but faced political pressure that transcended rational analysis. I need to present something to the Council. Some gesture that demonstrates Aegis Corporation takes civilian safety seriously. We'll implement enhanced civilian protection protocols across all operations, Gideon offered. Additional training for all security forces, new rules of engagement that prioritize civilian evacuation before threat elimination, and independent safety audits conducted by New Republic observers. And we'll provide compensation to the families of those who died, not because we admit liability, but because it's the right thing to do. That should help, Voss said, relief evident. But this incident has energized opposition to corporate security in general. There are senators arguing that the New Republic needs to expand its own defense forces rather than relying on private contractors. Which would take years to implement and cost exponentially more than corporate partnerships, Stan noted. But we understand political reality, Senator. If Quell's council decides to terminate our contract, Aegis Corporation will respect that decision and withdraw according to contractual provisions. We hope that doesn't happen. We believe our services remain valuable and our performance record speaks for itself. But ultimately, the choice belongs to your people. The transmission ended, and Gideon turned to Stan with controlled frustration. 37 casualties could derail everything we've built. If Quell terminates and other clients follow, the expansion collapses. It won't collapse, Stan said with certainty born from managing dozens of similar crises at Vought. This is a crisis, yes, but crises are manageable. We implement the protocols we promised, we demonstrate genuine concern for civilian safety, and we let our overall performance record speak for itself. Quell has been essentially pirate-free for 4 months. Pirates will return within weeks. The settlement that experienced casualties will likely face another attack without adequate defense. And Quell's government will realize that imperfect protection is preferable to no protection. Within 6 months, they'll request contract renewal, probably with less favorable terms for them because they'll be desperate. You're confident they'll fail without us, Gideon observed. I'm confident we've made ourselves essential, Stan corrected. That's different from confidence in their failure. Even if Quell successfully maintains security without Aegis, we have 14 other clients demonstrating our value. One contract termination doesn't threaten the broader strategy. It might actually reinforce it by showing other clients what happens when they lose corporate protection. Gideon nodded slowly, understanding the calculation. And the Mandalorian negotiations? Accelerate them, Stan decided. If we're facing political pressure over civilian casualties, securing Mandalorian partnership becomes even more valuable. Mandalorians are legendary warriors with cultural legitimacy. If they endorse Aegis Corporation, it provides cover against accusations that we're just corporate mercenaries. We need that political protection. Then we contact Djarin directly. Offer to begin formal negotiations earlier than planned. Yes. Frame it as flexibility responding to Mandalorian readiness rather than our strategic need. Let him think he's gaining advantage by accelerating the timeline. They returned to the arbitrator, leaving Kamino's storms and growing clone army behind. The facility represented their long-term strategic capability, 1,000 loyal soldiers annually that no governmental force could match for efficiency and dedication. But the immediate challenge was political, not military. Corporate expansion required managing perception as carefully as deploying forces. Aegis Corporation needed to be seen as helpful partners, not threatening mercenaries. They needed cultural legitimacy, political support, and client dependence that made removal unthinkable. Mandalorian partnership would provide all of that. Warriors whose culture commanded respect, whose endorsement would validate Aegis Corporation's methods, whose restoration would demonstrate corporate capability at unprecedented scale. Stan drafted the transmission to Din Djarin personally, crafting language that would appeal to Mandalorian pragmatism while concealing strategic urgency. Din Djarin, Aegis Corporation recognizes that Mandalorian factions are prepared to discuss Mandalore's rehabilitation sooner than originally anticipated. We're willing to accelerate our timeline and begin formal negotiations within 2 weeks rather than 6 months. This demonstrates our commitment to Mandalorian restoration and our flexibility in responding to your needs. We look forward to productive discussion about partnership that serves both our people's interests. Professional. Respectful. Completely concealing the fact that Aegis Corporation needed Mandalorian legitimacy more urgently than planned. He'll accept, Gideon predicted. He's been preparing for negotiations. Accelerating the timeline gives him less preparation, but it also brings Mandalore's restoration closer. He'll take the risk. And when negotiations begin, we give him what he thinks he wants, Stan continued. Technology transfer, training protocols, oversight mechanisms. All structured to ensure dependency during implementation while appearing to grant independence eventually. By the time Mandalorians realize the terms they negotiated don't provide what they thought, they'll be too integrated to withdraw without catastrophic consequences. It's elegant, Gideon admitted. And ruthless. We're offering genuine assistance while ensuring that assistance becomes permanent necessity. That's how the best empires are built, Stan replied. Not through conquest, but through making yourself indispensable. Not through fear, but through gratitude that slowly transforms into dependency no one recognizes until it's too late to escape. The response from Din Djarin came within hours. We'll meet in 2 weeks. Location to be determined by neutral third party. Come prepared for serious negotiation. This isn't guaranteed acceptance. Stan smiled at the Mandalorian's caution. It suggested competence, preparation, and awareness of the stakes. Good. Negotiating with competent opposition was more satisfying than exploiting incompetence. And the terms they'd ultimately agree to would be stronger for having been seriously challenged. Prepare the full presentation, Stan instructed Gideon. Geological surveys, rehabilitation timelines, financial projections, technology transfer protocols, training schedules. Everything we need to demonstrate that Aegis Corporation can actually deliver what we're promising. Because the negotiation only works if they believe we're offering something real. And we are offering something real, Gideon noted. That's what makes this perfect. Mandalore can be restored. Everything we're promising is genuinely possible. The manipulation isn't in false promises, it's in contract terms that create dependency while appearing to grant partnership. Stan looked out at the stars streaming past in hyperspace, thinking about the empire they were building. Not star destroyers and military occupation. Not imperial aesthetics and fear-based control. Just careful corporate integration that would make Aegis Corporation essential to dozens of systems' survival. By the time the galaxy realized what they'd built, it would be far too late to dismantle without catastrophic consequences. And that was exactly how it should be. Vought International had controlled 70% of the superhuman market in Stan's original universe. Aegis Corporation would eventually control far more in this galaxy, not through market dominance, but through becoming infrastructure that couldn't be removed without collapse. 2 weeks until Mandalorian negotiations. The neutral station hung in empty space between territorial jurisdictions, no new Republic authority, no Imperial remnant claims, just a trading post maintained by independent operators who asked no questions and honored no allegiances beyond profit. It was exactly the kind of location Din Djarin trusted for negotiations where both parties needed guarantees against treachery. The conference chamber was sparse, furnished with a simple table and chairs that had seen decades of use. Din arrived first, accompanied by Bo-Katan Kryze and a small team of Mandalorian advisors, an engineer named Casca Reeves, a legal consultant named Axe Woves, and a cultural historian whose responsibility was ensuring any agreements honored Mandalorian traditions. They wore armor but had agreed to leave heavy weapons outside the chamber. This was negotiation, not combat. Though Din suspected the two might prove indistinguishable before this was finished. Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon arrived precisely on time, accompanied by only two corporate assistants carrying data pads with presentation materials. They wore civilian business attire rather than military uniforms, a calculated choice that Din recognized as attempting to establish corporate rather than imperial context. Both men moved with the confidence of predators who'd already won and were simply working through formalities. Din hated them immediately. And respected them enormously. "Thank you for meeting with us," Stan Edgar began, his tone professionally cordial. "We understand this situation carries significant historical complexity given Moff Gideon's past actions. We appreciate Mandalorian willingness to look beyond that history toward potential future partnership. We're here because you're offering something no one else can provide," Bo-Katan replied, her voice carrying steel beneath diplomatic courtesy. "That doesn't mean we've forgotten what the Empire did to Mandalore. Or that we trust either of you. It means we're pragmatic enough to negotiate with enemies if that serves our people's interests." "Fair assessment," Gideon acknowledged. "And more honesty than most diplomatic proceedings allow. So let's maintain that honesty. Aegis Corporation needs Mandalorian partnership to establish legitimacy and cultural credibility. You need resources and expertise to reclaim your homeworld. Both parties have something the other wants. The question is whether we can structure an agreement that serves both interests without requiring either side to compromise core values." Casca Reeves, the engineer, pulled up her own datapad showing geological surveys and environmental analysis. "We've reviewed your preliminary data on Mandalore's contamination. Your assessment that rehabilitation is possible within 10 years appears accurate, assuming adequate resources and sustained effort. But your proposal lacks detail on how Mandalorians would participate in that rehabilitation beyond advisory capacity." Stan Edgar nodded, as if he'd expected exactly this challenge. "Let's address that directly. Aegis Corporation's standard model involves our teams managing operations with client oversight. But we understand that Mandalorian cultural identity is tied to self-sufficiency and warrior capability. A rehabilitation project where your passive recipients would undermine that identity even as it restored your homeworld." He pulled up a revised proposal on the chamber's central holographic display. "This is our alternative framework. Phase 1, Immediate Contamination Containment and Surface Preparation. This is primarily technological and requires Aegis expertise that Mandalorians don't currently possess. Duration, 18 months. Phase 2. Infrastructure Development and Ecosystem Restoration. This phase involves significant Mandalorian participation, with Aegis providing training and technology transfer. Duration, 4 years. Phase 3, Full Operational Handover. Mandalorians assume primary responsibility while Aegis maintains advisory presence. Duration, 4 years. Total timeline remains 10 years, but Mandalorian involvement increases progressively until you're managing your own world's restoration. Din studied the proposal carefully, looking for the trap he knew existed. The structure seemed reasonable, acknowledging Aegis expertise while building Mandalorian capability. But the details would matter. The contract clauses, the definition of advisory presence, the mechanisms for resolving disputes about operational control. What happens if we disagree about operational decisions during Phase 2? Axe Woves, the legal consultant, asked immediately. Who has final authority when Aegis experts and Mandalorian teams conflict about rehabilitation methods? Contractually binding arbitration, Stan Edgar replied without hesitation. Third-party technical experts, selected jointly by both parties, review the dispute and make binding determination. Neither Aegis nor Mandalorian leadership has unilateral authority to override technical assessment. And the cost structure? Bo-Katan pressed. Your initial proposal suggested percentage of restored planetary output. That's vague and potentially exploitative. Agreed, Gideon said. We've revised the financial framework. Fixed annual payments based on current Mandalorian collective resources, approximately 300 million credits annually. That's within your faction's combined financial capability without requiring debt financing. In exchange, Aegis absorbs all operational costs, technology expenses, and personnel deployment. You're paying for service delivery, not being charged for every component and worker hour. The room fell silent as Mandalorian advisors processed the proposal. 300 million credits annually was substantial but manageable, especially if distributed across multiple Mandalorian factions. And fixed payment meant no escalating costs or percentage claims on restored resources. It was, Din realized with uncomfortable surprise, a genuinely reasonable offer. Which made him even more suspicious of what he was missing. There's a dependency concern we need addressed, Din said, speaking for the first time since negotiations began. Your proposal has Aegis maintaining advisory presence during Phase 3. How long does that presence last? What prevents advisory from becoming operational control under different terminology? Stan Edgar smiled, that cold expression that Din recognized from predators evaluating prey. That's the question I'd ask in your position. And the answer is, contractual sunset clause. Aegis advisory presence terminates automatically after Phase 3 completion, 10 years from project initiation. At that point, all systems transfer fully to Mandalorian control. Aegis retains no ongoing authority, no permanent installations, no legal claim to Mandalore's operations. We pack up and leave. The only exception is if Mandalorians specifically request continued partnership through new contract negotiation. You'd walk away from billions of credits in investment. Bo-Katan said skeptically. From planetary infrastructure you built. That doesn't align with corporate profit motivation. It doesn't, Gideon agreed. Unless you consider the broader strategic picture. Aegis Corporation isn't building an empire through territorial control. We're building reputation through successful project delivery. If we restore Mandalore and hand it back to Mandalorians as agreed, that success becomes our most powerful marketing tool. Every struggling system in the galaxy will see that we actually deliver what we promise. That credibility is worth more than permanent control of one planet. Din looked at Bo-Katan, reading skepticism in her posture that matched his own feelings. But he also saw something else, hope. Desperate, carefully guarded hope that this might actually work. We need time to review this proposal in detail, Din said. Legal analysis, technical assessment, cultural evaluation. You're asking us to commit to 10 years and trust that you'll honor terms when they require you to abandon investment and control. Take whatever time you need, Stan Edgar said. We're not pressuring immediate acceptance. But I will note that the longer Mandalore remains toxic, the more difficult rehabilitation becomes. Environmental degradation is progressive. Waiting years to begin means adding years to completion. Your choice, but delay has costs. It was perfectly pitched, acknowledging their need for careful consideration while subtly pressuring decision. Din hated that it worked. Hated that Stan Edgar understood exactly which buttons to push. There's one more condition we require, Bo-Katan said, steel entering her voice. Mandalorian leadership during this project can't be corporate appointment or New Republic designation. It has to be chosen according to our traditions. The wielder of the Darksaber. Din Djarin. Both Stan Edgar and Gideon turned their attention to Din, and he felt the weight of their identical gazes like targeting sensors locking on. We have no objection to Mandalorian leadership selection, Stan Edgar said carefully. Though I'm curious whether Din Djarin objects, given his apparent reluctance to accept that role. I do object, Din said honestly. I'm a bounty hunter, not a leader. But if accepting leadership is the price of restoring Mandalore, I'll pay it. That's what Bo-Katan and every other Mandalorian advisor has made clear. I won the Darksaber. That makes me legitimate by our traditions. So I'll lead during this project, but only during this project. Once Mandalore is restored, I'm returning to the life I chose. Fair enough, Gideon said. Aegis Corporation needs unified Mandalorian leadership to ensure project coherence. We don't care whether that leader wants the role, we care that all Mandalorian factions accept their authority. If you're that person, we'll work with you. The negotiation continued for 3 more hours. Technical details, financial provisions, dispute resolution mechanisms, termination clauses. Din found himself grateful for his advisory team's expertise. Casca Reeves challenged every technical assumption. Axe Woves dissected contract language with legal precision. The cultural historian ensured nothing violated Mandalorian traditions. And through it all, Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon responded with professional competence that made Din increasingly uncomfortable. They weren't stonewalling or hiding terms. They were negotiating genuinely, accepting modifications, and explaining reasoning when questioned. It was exactly what competent partners would do. Which meant either this was legitimate partnership, or the trap was sophisticated enough that Din couldn't identify where it actually closed. By the time the session ended, they'd agreed to reconvene in 1 week with revised documentation addressing Mandalorian concerns. Both parties would conduct independent technical and legal review. If those reviews confirmed viability, they'd proceed to formal contract signing. After Stan Edgar and Gideon departed, the Mandalorian team remained in the conference chamber, processing what they'd just experienced. That was, Casca Reeves began, then paused, searching for words. More reasonable than expected. They accepted most of our modifications. The sunset clause is genuine, I verified the legal language. If they honor that contract, we actually get Mandalore back with full independence after 10 years. If they honor it, Axe Woves emphasized. Corporations always find loopholes. Always have mechanisms to extend advisory presence or claim unforeseen circumstances require continued involvement. We need to review every clause for hidden dependency creation. But even if we find those mechanisms, Bo-Katan said quietly, what's our alternative? Refuse their offer and watch Mandalore remain dead. They're right about one thing, delay makes rehabilitation harder. We've wasted years already because we couldn't unite our factions. This might be the only real chance we get. Din stood at the viewport, looking out at the stars that held no planet Mandalorians called home. He thought about Grogu, the child he protected and ultimately had to let go. He thought about the Darksaber, the weapon that made him relevant to decisions he'd never wanted to make. He thought about the trap he knew was closing but couldn't quite identify. Cara Dune warned me they were dangerous, Din said. New Republic intelligence thinks Stan Edgar might be from another universe, someone with corporate expertise from beyond our galaxy. Someone whose strategies we can't predict because they don't follow our precedents. Does that change the offer's legitimacy? Bo-Katan asked. No, Din admitted. But it means we're negotiating with someone who's built empires before. Someone who understands dependency creation better than we understand dependency resistance. We're outmatched strategically, even if the contract terms look fair. Then we proceed carefully, Casca Reeves suggested. Accept their proposal but maintain absolute vigilance during implementation. Watch for dependency creation. Build our capability as fast as possible. And if we detect exploitation, we terminate according to contract provisions before it's too late. Can we actually do that? Din asked. Walk away from Mandalore's restoration halfway through because we suspect manipulation. Could you order Mandalorian withdrawal from our homeworld's rehabilitation even if it means leaving it toxic? The silence that followed confirmed what Din already knew. Once they committed to this path, withdrawal would be almost impossible. Not because of contract provisions, but because of cultural psychology. Mandalorians wouldn't abandon their homeworld's restoration, wouldn't accept failure after hope had been offered. Which meant Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon understood Mandalorian psychology well enough to build the trap around it. "I'll sign their contract," Din said finally. "I'll lead during the rehabilitation. And I'll do everything possible to ensure we maintain independence while accepting their assistance. But I'm not naive enough to believe we're entering this as equal partners. We're accepting help from predators because we're desperate enough to take that risk." "This is the way," Bo-Katan said quietly, the traditional phrase carrying weight of resignation alongside hope. "This is the way," the other Mandalorians echoed, committing themselves to a path that might lead to restoration or might lead to something much worse. Din looked at the Darksaber one more time, this weapon that had made him a leader he'd never wanted to be. In 1 week, he'd sign a contract that would bind Mandalorians to 10 years of partnership with enemies they didn't trust. He'd accept responsibility for thousands of lives and the future of their entire culture. And he'd do it knowing the trap was real, knowing Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon were more dangerous than they appeared, knowing that every instinct screamed this would end badly. But he'd do it anyway. Because the alternative was watching his people fade into irrelevance while their homeworld remained a toxic memorial to imperial cruelty. Sometimes the way required accepting bad options because the alternatives were worse. Sometimes honor demanded walking into traps with open eyes because the stakes justified the risk. Din Djarin had never wanted to be a leader. But leadership, he was learning, wasn't about what you wanted. It was about what your people needed. And right now, they needed someone willing to negotiate with enemies, sign contracts with predators, and gamble their future on the hope that Mandalorian could outlast corporate manipulation. This is the way, he thought one final time. Even when the way led through corporate exploitation and strategic entrapment. Even when the way required trusting enemies because trust was the only path toward the future his people deserved. 1 week. 1 week until he committed Mandalorians to a path that would either restore their glory or complete their destruction. He'd spent his career making impossible choices. This was just one more. Except this time, the consequences extended beyond himself to encompass everyone who shared his culture and heritage. No pressure, he thought grimly. Just the entire future of Mandalorian civilization depending on one bounty hunter's ability to outsmart corporate strategists who'd built empires across universes. This is the way. And sometimes, the way was terrifying. 1 year later, Mandalore's atmosphere still tasted of death, but the promise of life had begun to take root. Din Djarin stood on the planet's scarred surface, watching massive atmospheric processors hum with steady power as they filtered toxins from air that had been unbreathable for years. Around him, Mandalorian engineers worked alongside Aegis Corporation technicians, their armor-clad forms moving through rehabilitation infrastructure with practiced coordination. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction. Instead, it filled him with growing unease that he couldn't quite articulate. The project was succeeding. That was undeniable. Phase 1 had completed 3 months ahead of schedule. Contamination levels had dropped 47%. Preliminary ecosystem restoration showed encouraging results. Mandalorian participation exceeded projections. Warriors who'd never considered themselves engineers or scientists had proven remarkably adaptable when their homeworld's restoration depended on acquiring new skills. Everything was going exactly as Aegis Corporation had promised. Which was precisely what worried Din most. The Western Continent Atmospheric Processing Array is online, Casca Reeves reported, approaching with a datapad showing system diagnostics. She'd transformed over the past year from warrior to technical specialist, learning Aegis systems with determined focus. That's the last major installation for Phase 1. We're ready to transition to Phase 2 infrastructure development. Ahead of schedule, Din observed. Gideon will be pleased. We all should be pleased, Casca said, though her tone carried similar unease to Din's feelings. But I keep waiting for the other boot to drop. For the moment when we realize the trap we walked into. Except it hasn't happened. They're delivering exactly what they promised, exactly how they promised to deliver it. Din had received regular intelligence reports from Cara Dune throughout the year, detailed analysis of Aegis Corporation's expanding operations. 23 client systems now. Corporate security forces deployed across dozens of sectors. Political influence growing as New Republic senators increasingly viewed Aegis as solution to security challenges governmental forces couldn't address. The Mandalore Rehabilitation Project had become their flagship success story, cited in contract negotiations across the galaxy as proof of corporate capability and trustworthiness. And Mandalorians had become the cultural face of that success. Warriors whose legendary status legitimized Aegis Corporation's methods and reassured potential clients that corporate security could honor tradition while providing modern protection. "That's the trap," Din said quietly, realization crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Not hidden contract clauses or dependency mechanisms we can identify and resist. The trap is that they're actually delivering what they promised. They're making us grateful. Making us advocates. Making us the proof that corporate partnership works." Casca stared at him, processing the implication. "We're legitimizing them. Every success here, every Mandalorian who praises Aegis Corporation's professionalism, every time we tell other systems that corporate rehabilitation actually works, we're helping them expand. We're the marketing tool they needed to build an empire. And we can't stop," Din continued, the full weight of their situation settling over him. "Because stopping means abandoning Mandalore's restoration. Means admitting we were wrong to trust them. Means watching our homeworld remain toxic because we were too proud to accept help that came with strings attached." Before Casca could respond, an alert came through Din's helmet comm, Moff Gideon requesting immediate conference. Din accepted, and Gideon's holographic image materialized, his expression carrying unusual tension. "Din Djarin, we have a situation that requires immediate Mandalorian leadership decision. A New Republic battle group has entered Mandalore's system. They're demanding inspection of our facilities and review of our contract terms. They claim concerns about militarization and potential Imperial resurgence." Din felt cold calculation settle over him, the same focus that had kept him alive through countless hunts. "What's their actual concern?" "Aegis Corporation has grown faster than they anticipated," Gideon admitted with unusual candor. 23 client systems, private military force of approximately 8,000 personnel, political influence they can't ignore. Some senators view us as threat to New Republic authority. Others see opportunity to regulate or absorb corporate security under governmental oversight. Either way, they're here to assess whether Mandalore rehabilitation is legitimate partnership or disguised Imperial restoration. "And is it?" Din asked directly. "Legitimate partnership?" Gideon met his gaze through the holographic display with that calculating expression Din had learned to recognize. "That depends on your definition of legitimate. Are we delivering what we promised? Yes. Are we building something larger than Mandalore's restoration? Also yes. Are those objectives incompatible? I don't believe so. But the New Republic might disagree. I'll handle the New Republic," Din decided. "This is Mandalorian territory, undergoing rehabilitation under contract between Aegis Corporation and unified Mandalorian leadership. They can inspect whatever they want, we have nothing to hide. But they don't dictate our partnerships." "Careful," Gideon warned. "Positioning Mandalore as independent from New Republic authority could trigger exactly the kind of conflict we've been avoiding." "We are independent from New Republic authority," Din corrected. "We always have been. Mandalorians don't answer to senators or governmental oversight. We honor our contracts and traditions. If the New Republic respects that independence, we'll cooperate with their inspection. If they try to impose authority they don't have, we'll remind them why Mandalorians have remained autonomous for millennia." Gideon smiled, genuine appreciation rather than calculated manipulation. "You're becoming quite effective at political leadership, Din Djarin. For someone who claimed to be just a bounty hunter. I'm learning from the best manipulators in the galaxy, Din replied dryly. Now let me handle the New Republic before they decide Mandalore restoration is cover for something more threatening. The New Republic battle group consisted of 3 corvettes and supporting fighter complement, enough force to demonstrate seriousness without suggesting invasion. Their commander was a Mon Calamari admiral named Bol Koden, whose reputation suggested competence without ideological rigidity. Din met him in the newly constructed operations center that served as Mandalore Rehabilitation Project headquarters. The facility was functional rather than impressive, deliberate choice to avoid appearing militaristic. Bo-Katan accompanied him, along with Casca Reeves and Axe Woves. Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon were notably absent, tactical decision to present this as Mandalorian authority rather than corporate operation. Admiral Koden, Din greeted formally. Welcome to Mandalore. You requested inspection of our rehabilitation operations. We're prepared to provide complete transparency. The Admiral's large eyes studied Din with careful assessment. We appreciate your cooperation, Mandalore. Your acceptance of that title has been noted with interest across the New Republic. A unified Mandalorian state led by Darksaber wielder represents significant shift in regional power dynamics. We're not building a state, Din corrected. We're restoring a homeworld. Mandalorians remain scattered across the galaxy by choice and circumstance. What we're creating here is cultural center, not political nation. With significant military capability, Admiral Koden observed. Aegis Corporation security forces number in the thousands. This facility could support fleet operations. The atmospheric processors could be weaponized with minimal modification. Forgive our skepticism, but these circumstances bear uncomfortable resemblance to imperial militarization that preceded galactic conquest. Bo-Katan stepped forward, her presence commanding immediate attention. Admiral, I fought the Empire for years. I watched them destroy Mandalore and slaughter our people. I know exactly what imperial militarization looks like. This isn't it. These are rehabilitation systems. Security forces protect construction operations from pirate raids and ensure worker safety. The comparison to imperial buildup is insulting and inaccurate. Then you won't object to our technical teams conducting independent assessment, Admiral Koden said smoothly. Verifying that these systems serve rehabilitation rather than military purposes. Confirming that Aegis Corporation presence here doesn't represent imperial remnant consolidation under corporate disguise. Inspect whatever you want, Din agreed. But understand one thing clearly, Mandalore answers to Mandalorian leadership. Not New Republic oversight. Not Senate committees. Not governmental regulation. We've contracted with Aegis Corporation through legitimate agreement between autonomous parties. If your inspection finds evidence of deception or illegal militarization, we'll address it according to our contract terms. But you don't dictate our partnerships. Admiral Koden regarded Din with something between respect and concern. You're aware that Aegis Corporation has expanded dramatically in the past year? That former Imperial officers command significant private military force. That senators across the New Republic are questioning whether we're witnessing emergence of corporate power that could rival governmental authority. I'm aware, Din said. I'm also aware that the New Republic struggles to provide adequate security for member systems. That pirate activity increases while defense budgets decrease. That idealistic governance philosophy creates power vacuums that someone will fill. Aegis Corporation fills those vacuums through legitimate contracts. If that bothers the New Republic, perhaps you should examine why your government can't protect citizens it claims to serve. The words were harsher than diplomatic protocol suggested, but Din was tired of navigating political nuance. He was a warrior forced into leadership, negotiating with empires and corporations while trying to restore a homeworld that shouldn't have needed restoration in the first place. Your point is valid, Admiral Koden admitted with surprising candor. The New Republic faces challenges we're still learning to address. But unchecked corporate military power creates its own dangers. Aegis Corporation operates across 23 systems now. They command private army larger than some planetary defense forces. They answer to no governmental oversight or democratic accountability. That concerns us regardless of current operational legitimacy. Then regulate them, Bo-Katan suggested. Create corporate security legislation. Establish oversight mechanisms. Do what governments should do when private entities gain concerning power. But don't interfere with legitimate operations because you're worried about hypothetical futures. Mandalore is being restored. Aegis Corporation is delivering exactly what they promised. If they violate laws or betray our trust, we'll address it. Until then, we're proceeding as agreed. The inspection lasted 3 days. New Republic technical teams examined every system, reviewed all documentation, interviewed Mandalorian workers and Aegis personnel. Din provided complete transparency, knowing they'd find nothing actionable. Because there wasn't anything actionable, just corporate rehabilitation operations functioning exactly as contracted. Which was, Din reflected bitterly, exactly the problem. The trap wasn't illegal activity or hidden militarization. The trap was legitimate success that made Aegis Corporation indispensable while making Mandalorians complicit in corporate expansion they couldn't oppose without abandoning their own restoration. Admiral Coden's final report acknowledged operational legitimacy while expressing significant concern about broader implications of corporate military expansion. The New Republic couldn't justify intervention, but they'd put Aegis Corporation on notice that governmental oversight was coming. After the New Republic departed, Stan Edgar finally appeared in person at Mandalore Operations Center. He deliberately avoided the inspection, maintaining corporate discretion while letting Mandalorian leadership handle political challenge. Now he wanted debrief. "You handled that excellently," Stan said, his approval genuine. "You defended Aegis Corporation's legitimacy while maintaining Mandalorian independence. Exactly the political balance we needed." "I defended our contract," Din corrected. "Not your corporation. Don't confuse the two." "Fair distinction," Stan acknowledged. "But the result serves both our interests." The New Republic found nothing actionable, Mandalore's restoration continues, and Aegis Corporation's reputation remains intact. Everyone benefits. "Except you're building an empire," Din said flatly. "Not through conquest, but through contracts. Not through fear, but through making yourselves essential. And Mandalorians are helping you build it because opposing you means abandoning our homeworld." Stan Edgar regarded Din with that calculating predator expression, and for a moment, Din saw past corporate civility to the ruthless strategist underneath. "You're right. I am building an empire. The most effective kind, one that people invite into their lives and thank for being there. Does that make me evil? Or just effective at providing services governments can't or won't provide?" "It makes you dangerous," Din replied. "More dangerous than the empire ever was, because people choose you. They sign your contracts and welcome your presence. And by the time they realize what they've actually invited in, removing you would cause more damage than accepting you." "That's not evil," Stan said quietly. "That's civilization. Every stable society depends on institutions that become too essential to remove without catastrophic consequences. Governments, corporations, cultural traditions, they all function through creating dependency that looks like partnership until examined too closely. I'm just better at building those dependencies than most." "And what happens when we don't need you anymore?" Din asked. "When Phase 3 completes and contractual sunset clause activates. Do you actually walk away from billions of credits in investment and leave Mandalore to independent operation?" Stan Edgar smiled that cold expression Din had learned to recognize. "Ask me in 9 years. By then, you'll know whether I'm a man who honors contracts or just another predator wearing different skin. But I'll note that reputation depends on delivering what we promise." If we violate the Mandalore contract after successfully completing rehabilitation, every other client terminates immediately. Our entire business model collapses. So yes, I'll honor the sunset clause, because betraying you destroys everything we've built. It was, Din realized, probably true. Which somehow made it more disturbing rather than less. Stan Edgar would honor their agreement not from principle but from calculated self-interest. And that calculation depended on circumstances remaining stable for 9 more years. Get back to work, Din said finally. Mandalore won't restore itself, and I've spent enough time on politics when there's actual labor to supervise. Stan Edgar departed, leaving Din alone with his unease and growing certainty that he'd made the right decision for wrong reasons. Or perhaps wrong decision for right reasons. Sometimes the difference was impossible to determine until consequences played out across years or decades. Bo-Katan found him hours later, standing at observation window watching Mandalorian workers learn Aegis systems with determined focus. We made the right choice, she said quietly, though her tone suggested she was convincing herself as much as reassuring him. Mandalore is being restored. Our people have purpose and hope. Whatever Stan Edgar and Gideon are building, they're also delivering what they promised us. For now, Din agreed. But in 9 years, we'll discover whether sunset clauses actually mean independence or just begin new phase of relationship we can't escape. And by then, we'll be so dependent on systems they built that choosing independence might not be possible regardless of contract terms. Then we use these 9 years, Bo-Katan said with familiar determination. We learn everything they teach us. We build capability they don't expect. And when Sunset Clause activates, we're actually capable of independent operation rather than theoretically free but practically dependent. Can we really do that? Din asked. Learn their systems fast enough and thoroughly enough to truly operate independently? Or are we just telling ourselves comfortable lies while walking deeper into the trap? I don't know, Bo-Katan admitted. But the alternative was watching our culture die while maintaining principles that meant nothing without people to uphold them. We chose survival over purity. We chose pragmatic partnership over ideological independence. Maybe that makes us complicit in whatever Aegis Corporation becomes. But it also gives our people a chance to actually survive rather than fade into legend. Din looked at the Darksaber hanging from his belt. The weapon that had made him responsible for these impossible choices. Leadership, he'd learned, wasn't about making right decisions. It was about making necessary decisions and accepting consequences regardless of personal cost. Mandalore would be restored. His people would go home. And whatever price that restoration ultimately required, Djarin would pay it. Because that's what leaders did. They bore burdens so others didn't have to. They made compromises that enabled survival. They negotiated with enemies and signed contracts with predators when those were the only options remaining. This is the way, Din thought. Even when the way led through corporate exploitation and strategic entrapment. Even when the way required building someone else's empire to save your own people. 9 years. 9 years until they discover whether Mandalorian will could outlast corporate manipulation. Whether sunset clauses meant freedom or just new phase of control. Whether accepting help from enemies had saved Mandalorian civilization or just changed how it was destroyed. 9 years. And every day until then, Din would work to ensure his people gained capability faster than Aegis Corporation built dependency. It was the only path forward. The only choice that honored both Mandalorian survival and awareness of the trap they'd willingly entered. This is the way. And sometimes, the way required accepting that you'd never know if you made the right choice until it was far too late to choose differently. 5 years after the signing. The Mandalorian sector had transformed from a scattered diaspora into a functioning cultural center, though not the nation-state New Republic strategists had feared. Mandalore itself was 73% rehabilitated, its atmosphere breathable in most regions, its ecosystems recovering with stubborn vitality that mirrored the warrior culture reclaiming it. Thousands of Mandalorians had returned home, building settlements that honored ancient traditions while incorporating modern infrastructure. And throughout it all, Aegis Corporation had delivered exactly what they'd promised. Djarin stood in the Mandalore Operations Center, now staffed primarily by Mandalorian personnel with Aegis advisors providing consultation rather than operational control. The transition to Phase 3 had occurred seamlessly 6 months prior. Casca Reeves commanded technical operations. Axe Woves managed resource allocation. Bo-Katan Kryze coordinated with scattered Mandalorian factions, maintaining cultural unity without imposing centralized governance. And Din wore the Darksaber with weary acceptance of burden he'd never wanted but had learned to carry. Aegis Corporation has submitted formal withdrawal timeline, Bo-Katan reported, pulling up documentation on holographic display. 5 years from now, as contractually specified, they'll complete advisory phase and transfer all systems to Mandalorian control. No extensions requested. No modification proposals. Just straightforward compliance with sunset clause we negotiated. You sound surprised, Din observed. I am, Bo-Katan admitted. We've spent 5 years waiting for betrayal. For the moment when they'd claim unforeseen circumstances required continued presence. For contract clauses that prevented actual independence. But it hasn't happened. They're actually going to honor the agreement. Din thought about Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon, those two identical faces representing ruthless corporate pragmatism that had built an empire across 47 systems now. Aegis Corporation had become exactly what they'd envisioned, essential infrastructure that governments couldn't replicate and citizens wouldn't oppose. They provided security, stability, and prosperity through contracts that created dependencies so complete that removal became unthinkable. But they'd also restored Mandalore. Genuinely. Completely. Exactly as promised. They're honoring the agreement because betraying us destroys their business model, Din said, understanding finally crystallizing after 5 years of observation. Aegis Corporation's entire value proposition is trustworthiness. If they violate the Mandalore contract, every client terminates immediately. They built an empire on delivering exactly what they promise. Breaking that pattern, even once, collapses everything. So we were never the target, Bo-Katan realized. We were the proof. The flagship success story that validates their methods and reassures future clients. Exactly. And in 5 more years, when they complete withdrawal as contracted, that success becomes permanent. Mandalore restored. Mandalorians independent. Aegis Corporation's reputation unassailable. Everyone benefits. Except the 47 systems that remain dependent on their security infrastructure, Bo-Katan noted quietly. The corporate empire they've built using our cultural legitimacy as foundation. Din had no response. Because she was right. Aegis Corporation had used Mandalorian restoration as proof of concept, demonstrating that corporate rehabilitation could work, that private security could be trustworthy, that partnerships could be genuine. And systems across the galaxy had accepted corporate integration because Mandalorians vouched for Aegis' credibility. They'd been complicit. Willingly. Knowingly. And they'd done it anyway because the alternative was watching their civilization fade into irrelevance. A transmission alert interrupted his thoughts, priority communication from Cara Dune on Hosnian Prime. Din accepted, and her holographic image appeared with expression mixing concern and grim satisfaction. Din, thought you should know. The New Republic Senate just passed corporate security regulation legislation. Aegis Corporation and similar organizations now operate under governmental oversight. Mandatory reporting requirements, operational restrictions, financial transparency. It won't dismantle what they've built, but it limits future expansion and provides accountability mechanisms. How did Aegis Corporation respond? Din asked. They supported it, Cara said, and Din heard surprise in her voice. Stan Edgar testified before Senate committees advocating for reasonable regulation. Said corporate security needs democratic oversight to maintain public trust. He helped write half the legislation that now governs his own corporation. Din almost laughed at the elegant manipulation. Stan Edgar had recognized that regulation was inevitable and had positioned Aegis Corporation as cooperative partner in creating that regulation, ensuring regulations served corporate interests while appearing to limit corporate power. It was the same strategy he'd employed with Mandalore. Accept constraints that looked restrictive but actually reinforced exactly what you'd already built. He's still 10 steps ahead, Din said. Still building exactly what he envisioned. We just can't see the full picture yet. Probably, Kara agreed. But he's also delivered what he promised. Mandalore is restored. 47 systems have effective security. The galaxy is more stable than it's been since the Empire fell. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to understand his full strategy as long as the outcomes serve people's interests. After the transmission ended, Din walked Mandalore's surface without armor, something impossible 5 years ago, but now routine as atmosphere approached full habitability. He passed Mandalorian children playing in settlements their parents had built. He saw warriors training in combat forms that honored ancient traditions. He watched engineers maintaining systems they'd learned to operate independently. And he understood, finally, what Stan Edgar had actually built. Not conquest. Not domination. But integration so complete that removing Aegis Corporation from 47 systems would cause catastrophic consequences. An empire built not through fear but through making themselves essential. A corporate structure that provided genuine value while creating dependencies no one recognized until those dependencies became survival requirements. Mandalore would be the exception, the one success story that proved corporate partnerships could end cleanly. But that exception would validate 47 other partnerships that would never end because ending them would mean collapse. It was brilliant. Horrifying. And completely unstoppable because it operated through voluntary choice and delivered genuine benefits. Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon had entered this galaxy and built exactly what they'd envisioned, an empire that would thank them for being conquered right up until the moment, possibly never arriving, when they realized conquest had occurred. And Mandalorians had helped them build it. Not through deception or manipulation, but through accepting partnership that served both Mandalorian interests and corporate strategy simultaneously. 5 years from now, Aegis Corporation would complete withdrawal from Mandalore as contracted. They'd honor the Sunset Clause. They'd transfer all systems to Mandalorian control. And their reputation would become unassailable, the corporation that actually delivered what they promised, that respected sunset clauses, that could be trusted even when trust seemed impossible. That reputation would be worth more than permanent control of Mandalore. It would open markets across the galaxy. It would make Aegis Corporation's model the template for corporate governance everywhere. It would complete the transformation from private security company to essential galactic institution. And Mandalorians would have their homeworld back. Genuinely independent. Fully functional. Exactly as promised. Both parties would get what they wanted. Both parties would consider the partnership successful. And historians would debate for centuries whether that success represented genuine cooperation or just sophisticated exploitation that both sides accepted because alternatives were unacceptable. Din Djarin looked up at Mandalore's healing sky and thought about the impossible choices that had led here. About accepting leadership he'd never wanted to negotiate with enemies he'd never trusted. About signing contracts with predators because those contracts offered salvation when salvation seemed impossible. This is the way, he thought one final time. Not the way he'd imagined as a foundling learning Mandalorian codes. But the way that actually existed in a galaxy where survival required compromise, where honor sometimes meant accepting help from enemies, and where the right choice often looked nothing like righteousness. Mandalore would live. His people would thrive. And whatever price that survival had cost in legitimizing Aegis Corporation's expansion, whatever role Mandalorians had played in building someone else's empire, Din would accept that burden. Because leadership wasn't about making perfect choices. It was about making necessary ones and bearing the consequences regardless of personal cost. The Darksaber hung at his belt, no longer feeling like a trap but simply like the weight of responsibility he'd learned to carry. In 5 years, he'd transfer that responsibility to whoever claimed it next. He'd return to the life he'd chosen, bounty hunting, independence, freedom from politics and corporate negotiations. But he'd never forget what he'd learned about power and empire. About how the most effective conquest looked nothing like invasion. About how systems could be enslaved through contracts they signed gratefully. About how the most dangerous predators were the ones who delivered exactly what they promised while building dependencies no one recognized until removal became impossible. Stan Edgar and Moff Gideon had taught him that lesson perfectly. And across 47 systems, that lesson was being learned by civilizations that would never quite understand what they'd invited into their essential infrastructure. The galaxy far, far away had changed. Corporate power had filled the vacuum between imperial collapse and New Republic inadequacy. And two identical faces from different realities had built an empire that would endure not through strength of arms but through simple fact that removing it would hurt more than accepting it. Mandalore was free. And everywhere else, freedom was becoming obsolete, replaced by partnerships that looked like choice but functioned like necessity. This is the way, Din thought. For better or worse. For salvation or damnation. For the galaxy that actually existed rather than the one Mandalorians had wished for. And in that complicated, morally ambiguous reality, sometimes making deals with predators was the only path toward survival.